Chapter 1955. The young man sat back on the bench and straightened his back. Old shopkeeper, I can't thank you enough for your kindness. The old man twirled his fingers and joked, Don't just say that. You'll speak with money in the future. The young man suddenly laughed. Old shopkeeper, aren't you afraid that I'll go back on my word in the future and refuse to pay the dividends after paying back the 300 taels of silver? The old man raised his eyebrows. After that, he pointed at the young man's chest and his own eyes. The reason for this deal is that I believe in your conscience and my own eyesight. The young man and the old shopkeeper each poured a cup of wine and raised their cups. It's all in the wine. The two drank the wine in one gulp. After the old man finished his wine, he said, You should go and see your wife. Oh right, go to the back of the cabinet and get a jug of green ant wine. Treat it as my celebration for you finally having your own business. The young man stood up and laughed. Sure. The old man reminded him, Celebration is one thing, but the wine will be on your tab. This green ant wine is not cheap. It's said that a jug from Bailiang costs less than 2 taels of silver. In Lianhuai, it costs more than 1 tael of silver. And from Gangnam-do to here, it costs 4 taels of silver. How is this selling wine? It's more like selling silver. You should drink slowly. Don't drink until you've drunk all the wine. The young man chuckled. I can't bear to drink it myself. The old man asked curiously, Why? Are you giving it to your brother or your father-in-law? The young man who went straight to the counter suddenly paused, turned around and grinned. Neither. I'm saving it for my brother. In the future, when he comes to my house to eat and drink, I'll treat him with this wine. Back then, a long time ago when I was hanging out with him, he always said that this green ant wine was the most delicious wine in the world. At that time, he always liked to use this wine to covet me. Later, we separated. There was one time when I passed by his hometown alone. I was in a hurry and didn't get to drink it. I don't know what it tastes like. The old man said unhappily, What tastes like? It's just that it's expensive. Other than that, I don't like to drink it. It's too strong and too strong. It burns through the throat and has a strong aftereffect. In my opinion, it's not as good as our homebrewed rice wine. The young man smiled and said, That brother of mine is half a Jianghu man. Riding a horse to drink wine, he naturally has to drink the strongest wine. Drinking that soft rice wine is not considered a hero. The old man was amused. Oh, so you're from the pugilistic world. Also, from what you've said, you've traveled quite far in the pugilistic world, haven't you? The young man scratched his head. It's just that I've gone far. The old man rolled his eyes. You've suffered before, haven't you? The young man laughed it off. The old man sitting alone at the table raised his cup and drank slowly. He looked at the waiter who was carefully holding the wine pot from afar and asked without any reason, Wen Hua, the storyteller in our restaurant said several times that the Northwest vassal king admitted that he had a brother in Jianghu who happened to have the same name as you? Then shouldn't your brother's surname be Su as well? The young man stood in the distance, a brilliant smile on his face. What a coincidence, it really is him. The old man laughed and waved his hand. Brat, get lost. The old man who had no wine in his cup shook the wine pot. It was empty. He turned his head and looked at the young man who was walking towards the door of the restaurant. The young man was limping, but he didn't give off a miserable or funny feeling. The old man suddenly laughed and asked, Wen Hua, are you really not that famous swordsman in the capital? The young man who was holding the pot of green ant wine slowly turned around and made a face. Shopkeeper, do I look like him? The old man smiled and didn't answer. He waved his hand again. The old shopkeeper returned to his seat. There was no more wine in the pot. The bored old man thought for a while and looked at the door. He laughed at himself and said, You don't look like him. That's right. Can you look like him? After the young man left the restaurant, he quickly walked towards the small bridge. Along the way, there was an endless stream of people on both sides of the river. As far as the eye could see, the quiet river was full of lit river lanterns. It was like a starry sky on a summer night. According to local folklore, after a person died, if those wandering ghosts could find the river lantern with their name on it on the day of the Hungry Ghost Festival, they could be reincarnated. Back then he had heard from his brother, who was a dog in Jianghu, that there was a Buddhist saying about reincarnation through a lantern. Especially for the resentful ghosts who couldn't be free in the netherworld, they could be free by relying on the lotus lantern on the river in the world of the living. One of his regrets in this life was that he and his brother could only afford for one of them to study. His brother gave him the opportunity, but he didn't like to study and didn't know how to cherish it. He only thought about doing chivalrous deeds all day long and yearned for the Jianghu where blades flashed and swords flashed. Therefore, he liked to nag his nephew even more than his brother and sister-in-law, telling him to study hard. The paper and brush he bought for his nephew were the most expensive and the best in town. He didn't hope that his nephew would pass the imperial examinations and become a scholar, nor did he want to bring honor to his family. Instead, he felt from the bottom of his heart that if a man studied hard, had a belly full of knowledge, and could write good characters, he wouldn't need to ask others for couplets every year. In other words, if he had a child in the future, he could go to the books and name his child. When it came to swordsmanship, there was only one person in the world who wanted to become the best in the world. When it came to fists, there would always be martial arts experts in Jianghu whose fists were harder. However, the principles that scholars read from books were definitely not the principles that emperors, kings, generals, ministers, high officials, and dignitaries spoke out. They would definitely be a bit more important. When he arrived at the familiar Bluestone Bridge, his wife had already sold 2 baskets of river lanterns. His nephew was holding the last one in his hand. She waited until he came closer before softly asking, "Why do you want me to leave one? Do you still want to write the 2 words Bailiang?" He smiled and said, "The young man I told you about is from Bailiang. Now that there's a war in the west, I want to pray for him." The 3 of them walked down the bridge together and came to the shore. He bent down and gently placed the river lantern into the river. The 3 of them sat side by side on the shore. He rubbed his nephew's head and asked him to help hold the bottle of green ant wine. He looked up and smiled at his wife. "If you have the chance to meet him in the future, don't agree to it if he calls you sister-in-law. He must call you sister-in-law." Her eyes curved as she smiled mischievously. "You two are also fighting over this kind of thing." He smiled happily. "We don't have to fight over other things, but we can't give in on this matter." She blushed slightly and said helplessly, "Then you still want to become in-laws with him in the future? You said that he agreed to your marriage when you were a child?" He said boldly, "Does he dare to not agree?" His wife smiled. She didn't know why her man didn't care about anything. Only when he talked about his brother would he be especially proud. Sometimes she even felt a little jealous. She didn't know what her man and his brother went through together that made him so reluctant to let it go. She knew better than anyone that this man with the surname Wen and given name Hua was actually able to take on and let go of anything. He even let go of the face that a man should care about the most. He looked at the river and said softly, "Wife, don't worry. I'm not thinking about the Jianghu that I went through back then. I'm just thinking about my brother." He then turned his head and grinned. "I can't help it. I know that without me in the Jianghu, no matter how well he does, he'll feel that it's meaningless." "Look, listen, it's that tone again." She rolled her eyes at him. He snorted. "Wife, don't believe me. Puma, who is my brother? When we went through the Jianghu back then, it was..." Suddenly, he saw his wife looking at him with a playful smile. He immediately changed his words. It was definitely filled with righteousness. "Yes, of course, it was just that we were a little miserable. We were full for 1 meal and hungry for 3. She pursed her lips and smiled. He lowered his head and said to his nephew, "That cheap uncle of yours always likes to recite a poem. I'll tell you. Have you seen it in a book before? The sun rises 10 feet high in Fusang. Everything in the world is as thin as a feather. A wild man sees injustice in anger and tears the ancient knife in his chest." The child who had just started learning in the village was naturally confused. He shook his head vigorously. He raised his head again and stared at the bright river with lanterns floating on the water surface. The cool breeze brushed his face and his expression was calm. He seemed to be talking to himself. "I'll keep the green ant wine for you and empty the house for you. Xiaoyan, if you still treat me as a brother, don't die outside Liangzhou Pass." Chapter 1956. If one looked closely at the map of Liang, one would find that Beiliang Road was like a narrow knife, and Beimang's border to the south of Gusai and north of Liangzhou was like a millstone. This vast battlefield was like a whetstone, and in the end, the Beiliang cavalry was the best in the world. Murong Baoding's vanguard cavalry split into two groups. The 30,000 Winter Thunder elite cavalry went straight for the left cavalry, while the 30,000 Ruren cavalry went straight for the right cavalry. This Beimang royal family member, who was also the governor of Juzi province, personally took charge of the middle infantry and did not put himself in danger. Aquarius province's disciplinary magistrate Wang Yong and Heshi province's disciplinary magistrate Helian Wei, after they surrounded Fuling and Liuya, these two towns, they similarly sent 20 to 30,000 cavalry south to reinforce the Winter Thunder elite cavalry and Ruren cavalry. Murong Baoding's intentions of being in charge of northern Liang's border cavalry was completely undisguised, but this was undoubtedly an open and above-board scheme. The northern Meng emperor and the peace magistrate precisely wanted to use Murong Baoding's two elite troops to tie down the left and right cavalry outside northern Liang Pass. They wanted to draw the snake out of its hole, have the two cavalry forces pull apart the distance between northern Liang City and northern Liang Pass, while also stopping the left and right cavalry forces from providing support to Huaiyang Pass defensive line. In short, Northern Meng wanted these two northern Liang field forces to be consumed between northern Liang City and Huaiyang Pass. Even though northern Meng's intentions were extremely clear, after the young vassal king and the various generals and elders discussed this, the northern city's discussion hall didn't shrink back in the slightest. From start to finish, no one asked if these two battles were going to be fought or not, instead discussing how to fight them. The commander of the right cavalry, Jean Partridge Shokong, stayed in the meeting hall in the end. He probably still had some matters to discuss with the young king. The deputy commander of the left cavalry, Lu Diyun, and the second commander of the right cavalry, Li Yanchao, who were about the same age, just happened to cross the threshold side by side. Li Yanchao was not familiar with Lu Diyun, who came out of nowhere. The youngest deputy commander in the history of the Manchu battalion, the old corporal of Li Mofan and Wang Lingbao, and the old soldier of the Su family who was on the same level as Su Pu, Wu Qi, and Lu Jinu, Li Yanchao, did not care about Li Yanchao, who only cared about military achievements. Moreover, it was very interesting. As a young general who rose to prominence in the border army during the time when Chen Zhibao was the first protector general of Beiliang, Li Yanchao and the other captains who joined the right cavalry, compared to the old Su family generals who rose to prominence in the late spring and autumn period, were very different in character and management. Just like after Lu Diyun returned to the border army, even though he held the actual military power of the left cavalry, he did not have the official custom of a new official making drastic changes. Usually, when he inspected the cavalry, he did not have a straight face. He also turned a deaf ear to Chen Zhibao's strict military rules of Beiliang. If he did not care about it, he would not care about it, or discuss military affairs in the meeting hall. He was also not as serious as Li Yanchao. Even when the young king asked him personally, Lu Dian had a lazy expression, as if nothing in the world was a problem. This naturally made Li Yanchao, who was strict in managing the army, displeased him and had no intention of befriending him. Lu Diyun and Li Yanchao walked side by side to the barracks. There were some specific matters that needed to be discussed with Yang Xinxing. For this kind of large-scale deployment of troops, not only Yang Xinxing, the deputy military governor, but also Bai Yu, the head of the household department, had to participate. Li Yanchao suddenly stopped and took the initiative to say to Lu Din, "Can I have a few words with you?" Lu Diyun naturally did not refuse. The two did not rush to enter the barracks, but walked down the stairs. There was a wooden archway directly opposite the meeting hall and the 6 departments in the east and west wing. There were words on both sides. On the south side, there were 4 golden words on a red background, Northwest, written by the young king himself. On the north side was a Beiliang official maxim written by Li Yishan, "Heaven and earth can be bullied, but not the people." When the members of the vassal residents were in charge of military and political affairs, they could see this maxim when they looked up. Lu Dun led Li Yanchao to the wooden archway, smiled and went straight to the point. "I know that my position should have been yours, Li Yanchao. If you have any ideas about this, I can't stop you even if I wanted to. Li Yanxiao frowned and did not speak. Lu Diyuan, who was wearing armor, raised his arms and rubbed his hands vigorously. The pieces of armor clattered, and this newly appointed deputy commander of the left cavalry, who had ascended to the heavens in one step, gently exhaled. The relationship between the left and right cavalry outside the Great Pass has always been good. Otherwise, we would not have the ability to arm wrestle with the great snow dragon cavalry everywhere. Even the Xinli Ranch and Tianjing Ranch have become our backyard. It is said that in the early years before the Longxiang army had moved to Liuzhou, they had a conflict with the left cavalry over the matter of 200 A-class warhorses. At that time, Li Mofan and Wang Lingbao, the two deputy commanders of the Longxiang army, were very fierce. The original commander of the cavalry, Zhong Hangu, could not suppress them. The previous protector general, Chen Jibao, was not willing to interfere. In the end, it was the right cavalry that sent out 2,000 first-class elite cavalrymen to rush to the left cavalry's camp overnight. It was obvious that they wanted to support old Commander He, who had already decided to take a step back. Only then did they manage to snatch back the two good horses. After so many years, the left and right cavalry has been very united, so they more or less have conflicts with the Longxiang army, the White Feather Light Cavalry, and the Iron Stupa. I've heard a saying that the words of the junior captains in charge of the logistics and miscellaneous tasks in the left and right cavalry have more authority than the captains in Bailiang. It is to the extent that the leaders of the four major military towns outside the Great Pass, Liuya, Fuling, Zhongzhong, and Qingyuan, are all afraid of the left and right cavalry. Li Yanxiao's tone was indifferent. Lu Dian, don't forget that you are now the deputy commander of the left cavalry. If you say these heartfelt words to the prince, it might be useful. But if you say them to me, Li Yanxiao, it's meaningless. Lu Diyuan curled his lips and turned back to look at the meeting hall and the 6 rooms. They were all busy figures with hurried footsteps. He patted the heavy armor on his body and laughed. The Su family that I know was not like this in the past. They were all a bunch of uncouth men, all of them carrying swords, bows, and armor. Even the only 2 scholars by the general's side, Sir Li and Sir Zhao, used to carry swords and participate in meetings. Today, in the general's residence, Li Gongda, Bai Yu, and the others are wearing civil official robes, while the military counselors are wearing scholarly robes. Looking around, there are so many scholars. There are very few people who wear turtle shells like us. Li Yanxiao, who still had a lot of matters to deal with personally, said in a low voice, "The war is imminent, and the military affairs are heavy. Lu Diyuan, if you have something to say it directly. Don't beat around the bush with me. I won't play along." Lu Diyuan nodded, not angry at Li Yanxiao's arrogant attitude. He smiled and said, Lu Dian, I'm a donkey. I haven't been taken out for a walk for nearly 20 years. Since the prince trusts me and has allowed me to sit on the actual first seat of the left cavalry, then I can't let the prince down. Speaking of which, I, Lu Dian, have fought more than 60 battles and have never lost. This time, I definitely won't lose. Today, I called you out for a chat to let you know that the left cavalry has been handed over to me. The prince can rest assured, old Marshal he can rest assured, and also you, Li Yanxiao, can rest assured. We have to let everyone know that the left and right cavalry have always been arrogant and domineering, but we have the qualifications to be domineering. If you don't believe me, then let everyone open their eyes and watch. What to choose Twin Jade Annulus, Ko Jianghuai, Xie Shibei, Chao Benlei, Yueqi. In front of the seniors of the Su family's Iron Cavalry, in the future, on the day of rewards, as long as you meet on the road, you have to obediently step aside. Lu Diyuan turned his head and looked directly at Li Yanxiao. Old Li, what do you think? Li Yanxiao sneered. Your words are still acceptable. Whether or not you have the ability, I'll wait and see. Next, if the left cavalry can kill half as many enemies as my right cavalry, I'll treat you to a drink in North Town. If not, when you meet me at that time, scram to the side. Lu Diyuan reached out and patted Li Yanxiao's head. You brat, your temper is even worse than the great generals in the past. Li Yanxiao, who had almost never been patted on the head in his life, was stunned. By the time he regained his senses, Lu Duan had already run away. At the entrance of the meeting hall, Partridge Shou Kong, who had witnessed this shocking scene, also widened his eyes. He said helplessly, "This Lu Duan is really something. He even dares to touch Li Taisui's head." Su Fengnian dismissed it with a smile. He said softly, "If that's the case, the left and right cavalry's burden will be somewhat heavy." Zhou Kong snorted coldly. "Since your highness believes that Ko Jianghuai and his group of youths can make a name for themselves in Liuzhou, I can't be bothered to say anything about the muddled account of Qingyuan military town. However, even without the support of Stone Talisman, Ning Amei, and Yuan Nanting, old he's left cavalry and my right cavalry against Murong Baoding and Wang Yong and Helian Wei behind them, your highness can put your heart back into your stomach." Su Fengnian hesitated for a moment, then said, "The 30,000 Winter Thunder Cavalry and the 30,000 Ruren Cavalry can be considered Beimang's first-rate elite army in the Southern Dynasty. Beimang is willing to use such a large amount of bait. You must not let your guard down." Zhou Kong grunted in agreement. Su Fengnian suddenly clasped his fists towards the old commander who had once sent him off to the capital. He said, "Have a safe journey." Partridge Shou Kong also clasped his fists and said in a low voice, "Only death, only death." The two were well aware. In reality, only death. Chapter 1957. Liuzhou was on the verge of erupting. At that time, neither side in Liangmeng realized that this was going to be a battle that would determine the outcome of the war. It would be on par with the Battle of the Western Wall that ended the chaos of the spring and autumn period. After Northern Mang's great commander Huang Songpu achieved a great victory, he rushed downwards in an imposing manner, heading straight for Lu Province's central Green Sky City. At the same time, Northern Mang's emperor who wanted to make the final decision didn't hesitate to empty out Gusai Prefecture's military forces, transferring 40,000 Southern Dynasty's border elite troops to reinforce Huang Songpu's main force. The two main relay routes that connected more than 30 large and small military towns were packed with people. Without stopping to rest, they rushed south. Both armies gathered on the vast plains to the left of the Old Woman Mountain. This place was less than 70 miles away from Qingtsong City. Not long ago, Liuzhou General Ko Jianghuai had given Beimang a huge victory on the northern battlefield, greatly boosting the morale of Beimang's north and south capitals. However, whether it was the Beiliang Governor General House or the North Jebei City Manor, they did not demote Ko Jianghuai. Hence, Ko Jianghuai was still the main commander of this battle. He led 10,000 young Liuzhou cavalry, 20,000 Longxiang army, which was a level higher than the Liuzhou cavalry, and 16,000 Lantua mountain monk soldiers under his command. Probably because they knew that this battle would determine the ownership of the entire Liuzhou territory, Qingtsong City also sent out the 3,000 cavalry that were under the provincial governor's manor. The four Liuzhou powers had a huge disparity in numbers, and there were close to 50,000 troops in Liuzhou. It could be said that they were staking everything on one throw, and Ko Jianghuai had full control over them. Although Liang Mang and Huang Songpu's forces had a smaller advantage compared to their initial numbers, the grassland cavalry still had the upper hand in terms of numbers and morale. This was mainly due to Ko Jianghuai's muddle-headed deployment of troops. The Lantua mountain monk soldiers that rushed to assist Liuzhou were separated from the Liuzhou border cavalry, causing the Longxiang army to suffer heavy casualties for the first time since it was formed. As a result, the morale of these troops was greatly boosted. After 3 battles, Huang Songpu's elite cavalry still had 12,000 cavalry left. If one counted the Qingcalan troops that were almost completely wiped out, they had lost more than half. From this, one could see that the Battle of Liuzhou was undoubtedly a tough one. These 10,000 elite cavalry were undoubtedly the stabilizing force for the next battle. Wanyan Yinjiang, who was born in Longguan Pass, had lost all face in the second battle. It was precisely because of his mistake that Northern Mang was unable to form a tight encirclement, allowing Ko Jianghuai's main force to break through the encirclement easily. His brother, Wanyan Jinliang, who was the most powerful person in the Southern Dynasty, sent a secret letter to reprimand him before the biting emperor. The wording was extremely strict, and the meaning behind it was to tell Wanyan Yinjiang that if he was unable to redeem his family's face in Liuzhou, then the family would have to close the door to him. Before the third battle of Liuzhou began, Wang Lin not only gathered all the generals in the army, but he also called all the centurions to the empty space outside the tent. He made everyone sign a military order that on the battlefield, if no one within 10 people was able to kill the enemy, then the squad leader and the centurion would be executed on the spot. A chiliarch would be demoted to a centurion. Therefore, in the third battle, Wang Lin's cavalry soldiers were not afraid of death. After the battle, they indeed had a lot of gains. Their military exploits surpassed that of Huang Songpu's main force. They even left behind the Yi family's cavalry. When this report, personally written by old Marshal Huang Songpu, was sent back to the two capitals of the grassland, the Wanyan army caused a sensation in the southern dynasty. The old lady was very happy and bestowed the Wanyan family with a total of 18 Xianbei belts. This meant that the Wanyan family would have an extra 18 Xieshui guards. More importantly, this battle ensured that the Wanyan family would sit firmly on the throne of the southern dynasty. However, the repercussions were that after going through that brutal battle, the Wanyan tribe's elite cavalry had been reduced to 14,000 men. In addition, the head of the Wanyan tribe, Wanyan Jinliang, had to stay on the second front outside of Liangzhou Pass. Similarly, with the impending battle, the Wanyan tribe's descendants had all left the nest. Among the troops that were sent to reinforce Liangzhou Pass, there wasn't a cavalry troop that belonged to the Wanyan family. Currently, in the southern border of Beimang, Gusai Prefecture and Longyao Prefecture, other than the troops and horses that were sent south to attack Liangzhou Pass, the rest of the troops that were stationed there had been influenced by the remnants of Hongjia's people who had fled to the north. They had long known that this was a rare commodity that was worth hoarding. This was especially so when the importance of Gusai Prefecture was slightly lower than Longyao Prefecture, where the central army of Beimang was located. Coincidentally, it was a critical moment for the troops that were sent south to reinforce Liangzhou Pass. Almost all of the troops guarding Liangzhou Pass and Maolong Pass had privately offered a price. After all, going south to Laolong Pass was the general trend, and no one could refuse the emperor's order. However, there were a lot of things that needed to be done under the table. For example, the Wanyan family was afraid that Wanyan Yinjiang would make a mistake in the next battle due to the lack of troops, so they secretly offered a price to Ligu and Maolong towns, which were second only to tile-building Gentleman's Pavilion, in an attempt to persuade the two cavalry troops to take care of the imperial army during the Battle of Laolong Mountain. Unexpectedly, the two generals of the two towns firmly refused. It turned out that the Yi families that were also on the front lines of Liuzhou Pass had already taken the initiative to spend a large amount of money to form a temporary alliance with them. Furthermore, the price they offered was much more sincere than the reserved Wanyan family. For example, the family that bought Maolong Town's 5,000 cavalry troops not only promised that the daughter of the family would be married to the eldest son of the cavalry general, but they also offered chests of gold and silver that amounted to 400,000 taels of silver to Maolong Town. Logically speaking, after 3 fierce battles in a row, the 2nd Cavalry, which had the weakest combat power and the largest number of soldiers, should have suffered the heaviest losses. However, the result was unimaginable. Before the southern expedition, there were more than 40,000 cavalrymen of mixed brands. Of the 40,000 cavalrymen who survived to advance to the battlefield of Crone Mountain with their commander-in-chief, Huang Songpu, there were still 34,000 cavalrymen who survived. In addition to the military forces of Gusai Province, which were advancing south at full speed, the 40,000 cavalrymen of the southern dynasty who had been recuperating in the rear from the beginning to the end were all kept by the second noble families with a large sum of money. Apart from the 20,000 cavalrymen who were the old king of the southern courtyard, Huang Songpu's old subordinates who would obviously follow the old commander-in-chief's lead, the remaining 20,000 cavalrymen were all divided up by the second noble families. Huang Songpu, who had already lost his position as the king of the southern courtyard, could do nothing about it. The old lady sitting on the dragon throne, who was concerned about the central plains, turned a blind eye to it. Huang Songpu, who had a large number of reinforcements, did not act rashly. Otherwise, in this grand battle that was about to begin, the main battlefield would be under Qingcang City, and not on Crone Mountain, which was like a small island floating alone in the sea. The area to the right of Crone Mountain was dozens of li, with strong winds and strong sand. The large expanse of rugged terrain was naturally extremely difficult for cavalry to gallop through. In the first battle between Liang Mang and Lu Gai, the cavalry under Crone Mountain had successfully advanced south from the plains on the left flank of Crone Mountain. However, at that time, the border army of Liuzhou was only defending the city to the death. Their military strength was also relatively weak. The refugees had not yet joined the army on a large scale, and the Longxiang army was alone. The main force in the field was not enough to support a large-scale cavalry battle far away from Qingcang City. As a result, they did not choose to take the initiative to intercept. However, it was clear that today was different from the past. After Ko Jianghuai obtained the complete military power of a province, coupled with the fact that the Beiliang governor-general and the young vassal king attached great importance to Liuzhou, Ko Jianghuai not only fought 3 soul-stirring interception battles, he also resolutely chose the flat and vast Crone Mountain as the final battlefield. If they won, the Beimang cavalry would never be able to see the walls of Qingcang City. If they lost, then not only would Qingcang City fall into the hands of the Beimang cavalry, Liuzhou would probably become a new province of the southern dynasty of Beimang. Crone Mountain was not tall and steep. Instead, it was like a large mound of dirt. The north and south slopes were enough for a small group of cavalry to ride their horses up to the top. Even the most muddle-headed general would feel that occupying Crone Mountain to look down on the battlefield was beneficial for him to assess the situation and mobilize his troops. Ko Jianghuai was one of the 2 jade annulus of Dechu, and Huang Songpu had once used his military exploits to become a meritorious general of the southern courtyard. Hence, the battle for the high ground of Crone Mountain had already begun before the 2 armies officially engaged in battle. Huang Songpu did not have the selfish intention of wasting the elites of the other divisions. He decisively sent out the remaining 400 green grass bars to climb up the mountain with shields and blades. The green grass bars had always been on the same level as the crow bars under Dong Zhuo and to the black fox bars under General Lu Gai. They were ranked in the top 3. Although they were dismounted to fight, their bodies were strong and their strength was shocking. They were good at close combat. As expected, the Liuzhou side sent out 600 white horse crossbowmen, similarly armed with blades and shields. They climbed up the mountain at almost the same time. Both sides entered the battlefield of Crone Mountain at almost the same time and started to fight for Crone Mountain at almost the same time. This was probably the so-called coincidence of fate. Chapter 1958. Naturally, Huang Songpu did not think that 400 grassy barricades would be enough to take down the peak of Crone Mountain. After this batch of elite horse barricades, there were 600 men of sacrifice drawn from the various divisions. With the grassy barricades nailed to the peak of Crone Mountain, Wuxia and Xianxia and the other nobles and generals did not hesitate at all. In these 3 battles, Old Marshal Huang Songpu's performance was completely different from Dong Zhuo in the first battle of Liang Mang. He did not take any actions to weaken the strength of the other divisions. Every time, he fought to the death first and people died first. In these 3 difficult battles, Old Marshal Huang Songpu had reported to the emperor and was very protective of them. Twice, he took all the blame, and the 3rd time, he generously gave out military merit. Under these circumstances, even the gloomy Wuxia and Xianxia would feel bad. Of the 600 men of sacrifice, Wuxia and Xianxia sent out 300 Wuxia disciples. As expected, in a small-scale battle, without the leeway brought by the warhorses, people died even faster. The 400 grassy barricades quickly died. Looking up from the foot of the mountain, the peak of Crone Mountain was filled with the figures of the remaining white horse crossbowmen. The 600 men of sacrifice of the southern court aggressively entered the battlefield. The side of Liuzhou seemed to only use the white horse crossbowmen as an opportunity to seize the initiative, and definitely did not have the intention of letting all the crossbowmen die at Crone Mountain. This was also within reason. The ownership of Crone Mountain was, of course, important, but it could not be considered crucial, and could not be said to affect the outcome of the battle. If the battle between Liang Mang and Liang Mang was on the map of the Central Plains, where the tempo of the battle was slower than that of a cavalry battle, the gains and losses of Crone Mountain would be more significant. However, in a cavalry battle, especially a large-scale cavalry battle where both sides had accumulated more than 100,000 soldiers, and both sides were familiar with fighting on horseback, opportunities were often fleeting. In addition, Crone Mountain was not located at the center of the battlefield, but at a side away from the battlefield. When the time came, the side that lost Crone Mountain could very well take the initiative to move the main battlefield away from Crone Mountain. In this way, Crone Mountain's geographical advantage to observe the battlefield would be weakened. Therefore, both sides knew that the battle for Crone Mountain was bloody and bitter. To a large extent, it could be said that it was used to raise the morale of the soldiers at the foot of the mountain. Liu Zhou's reinforcements quickly arrived at the peak of Crone Mountain, consisting of close to 1,000 Lantua mountain monk soldiers. The white horse wandering crossbowmen who had fought from outside Liangzhou Pass all the way to Liu Zhou's border, compared to their mortal enemy Kinkolanzi who had been completely wiped out on the battlefield, their losses were not small either, close to 300 people dying on the mountain peak. At the foot of the southern slope of Crone Mountain, away from the main battlefield, the leading general Ko Jianghuai was actually among them. The military authority of the 10,000 Liuzhou youths had already been completely handed over to Chief Fulong Pass. As for the 20,000 Longxiang army, on the battlefield where they faced off against Beimang's main force, it was naturally Su Longxiang and Li Mofen who each led 10,000 cavalry. Ko Jianghuai only spoke about how to win this battle, how to deploy the troops in detail and how to generally deploy them, but he definitely would not interfere with the killing of the Longxiang army after they entered the battlefield. The 3,000 cavalry directly under the Liuzhou provincial governor's mansion also did not appear here, instead following behind the 10,000 cavalry from Chief Fulong Pass, forming a central army. The two wings were the even stronger 10,000 dragon elephant cavalry. Huang Songpu did not leisurely head to the foot of Crone Mountain's northern slope like Ko Jianghuai to oversee his own central army. When the old general vaguely saw the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain appear at the summit, the old general with a grave expression finally let out a light breath of relief. In the previous third battle, the monk soldiers of Xie Shibian were not even worth his weight in gold. They were practically a burden that held him back, allowing this Southern Dynasty great general to obtain a great victory that even Taiping Ming did not expect. His military service was so great that it shook the grasslands. However, in the depths of Huang Songpu's heart, he instead felt even more apprehension towards the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain that the Beimang had obtained through winning the Battle of Miyun Pass. He was not as optimistic as many of the Southern Dynasty border army generals who believed that the reason for the defeat of the Liuzhou border army was that Ko Jianghuai intentionally suppressed Xie Shibian, whose name shook the world at the Battle of Miyun. Huang Songpu firmly believed that this was a trap set by Ko Jianghuai and Xie Shibian for him. If he was not careful, the people who would be strangled by the neck would be tens of thousands of grassland soldiers. Wanyan Yinjiang, who was holding an iron spear and wearing heavy armor, urged his horse over. He loudly asked, "Great General, when do we charge?" Huang Songpu glanced at the direction of Crone Mountain and calmly said, "Wait a little longer." Wanyan Yinjiang, who knew the inside story of the military, was a little puzzled. Other than the 400 grassland soldiers and the 600 death warriors of the Southern Dynasty, the old general still had a backup plan. A total of 1,500 elite soldiers. Using these elite soldiers to fight for Crone Mountain showed how much importance he placed on it. However, even Wanyan Yinjiang, who was not as talented in military strategy as the old general, knew that the number of soldiers he had was still too little. With the Beiliang Frontier Army's character of wanting to lose people, they could not afford to lose face. At the very least, they would need to add another 1,000 soldiers to ensure that they would be able to take over Crone Mountain. One Crone Mountain was only worth this price. If more soldiers were sent in, more people would die on the mountain. For both sides, Liang Mang and Liang Mang, it would be a loss. The old general Huang Songpu obviously did not plan to take over Crone Mountain from the start. Instead, it was more of a test. After going through 3 battles, Wanyan Yinjiang knew his own worth. His arrogant personality had long been smoothed out. He was completely convinced of the old general's ability in military strategy. Since Huang Songpu said to wait a little longer, Wanyan Yinjiang, who was bound to the old general for good or ill, did not say any more nonsense. The figures of soldier monks appeared on the surface of the water in an endless stream. These monks of Mount Lantua, who possessed extraordinary combat strength, were especially eye-catching on the summit of Old Woman Mountain. 1,500 northern Mang and southern dynasty border soldiers all bravely sacrificed themselves. In the end, there were still 200 monks of Lantua Mountain standing at the peak of Crone Mountain. Their robes were bright red and dazzling. Furthermore, the number of Lu province soldiers was still increasing. They displayed a ferocious attitude, as if they were going to take down this old lady of Crone Mountain. Wanyan Yinjiang quietly stopped his horse beside the old general. His brows were tightly furrowed. With the last of their reinforcements all dead, this also meant that Crone Mountain could be considered the exclusive property of the Lu province cavalry. Huang Songpu hesitated for a moment. He turned his head and asked, "General Wanyan, how many people do you think the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain have sent out for Crone Mountain?" Wanyan Yinjiang subconsciously replied, "From the looks of it, 1,000 people have died in battle." Huang Songpu dismissed it with a laugh. He did not bother about this Beimang noble's irrelevant answer. He raised his head to look at the clear sky. He nodded and muttered to himself, "No matter what, we can start fighting." Along the not-so-steep southern slope of Crone Mountain, 3 young men slowly led their horses forward. Lu Province's General Ko Jiangjun, Bailiang's only remaining white horse crossbowman Captain Li Hanlin, and Lu Province's Deputy General Chen Shiliang, who had personally brought 3,000 reinforcements to Ko Jianghuai. Other than the hundreds of monk soldiers on the peak, there were no other soldiers at the foot of the mountain behind the 3. Other than the white horse crossbowmen resting on the ground, there were no other soldiers. Li Hanlin was the first to leave the group. Together with his fellow officers, he moved the corpses of those who had died in battle down the mountain. Not far from Li Hanlin, there was a tall man dressed in ordinary border army attire without a saber. What was even stranger was that everyone ignored him. As they approached the peak, Chen Shiliang asked softly, "General Ko, how did you guess that Huang Songpu would use less than 3,000 people to fight for Crone Mountain?" Ko Jianghuai smiled. "After fighting 3 battles with him, I have a general idea of Huang Songpu's temperament. He is a seasoned and prudent general. He knows that Crone Mountain can't decide the direction of the battle. If it weren't for the fact that he didn't know the whereabouts of the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain, he wouldn't have sent the last 1,500 people to their deaths. Now he can see that I am determined to use the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain to take Crone Mountain. I guess the old man will be relieved, because I gave a strict order from the beginning that no one of Beimang's men of sacrifice is allowed to live on the peak and pass on the military intelligence after seeing the details of the situation at the foot of the mountain. So I had no choice but to ask Li Hanlin's follower, the Grandmaster, to secretly help me in order to prevent Huang Songpu from guessing how many monk soldiers are stationed on the southern slope." Finally reaching the top of the mountain, Chen Shiliang looked to the north and said bitterly, "Even if he knows that there are only 1,500 monk soldiers on the southern side of Crone Mountain, I believe that Huang Songpu will never be able to guess where the main force of the monk soldiers is. Because even I, Chen Shiliang, still find it inconceivable." The Liuzhou general said expressionlessly, "Life and death are decreed by fate, riches and honor are up to the heavens." His appearance on that battlefield was Xie Shibian's own choice. Moreover, Ko Jianghua did not want to stop him. Chen Shiliang, who was in a complicated mood, could only sigh. During the Battle of Miyun, Xie Shibian defended the mountain pass to the death. Following this, Xie Shibian had to personally lead 10,000 monk soldiers to resist the 60,000 reinforcements from the southern border alone. His goal was to have the Liuzhou cavalry work together with the Qingyuan army to swallow up Huang Songpu's main force. Even Chen Shiliang, who was a layman in military affairs, knew that in some battlefields one could fight to the death, but in other battlefields one could not. Chen Shiliang could not understand. Ko Jianghuai did not personally give the order, but Xie Shibian had already taken the initiative to bring up this matter. At that time, everyone, including Su Longxiang, Li Mofan, and Liuzhou provincial governor Yang Guangdou, were hesitant. This was because everyone knew that even if all 20,000 of the Longtime mountain monk soldiers were added together, in the young king's mind, they were not as important as Xie Shibian, who he had personally taken away from West Chu. Only Ko Jianghuai dared to openly agree and let Xie Shibian die. In the rugged area west of Crone Mountain, Xie Shibian stopped his horse. Behind him were more than 10,000 monk soldiers. Everyone had abandoned their blades and carried large shields, holding long spears to stop the horse. When the middle-aged warrior monk who acted as the scout returned and reported that there were no Beimang scouts 10 li ahead, the main general Xie Shibian raised his arm and moved forward. Only then did the troops continue to move forward quickly. Xie Shibian, whose lips were dry, grinned and exhaled softly. For some reason, he thought of the delicate girl who often walked past his door with her head down and sunbathing when he was young. South of Bailiang there was her. The reason was enough. Chapter 1959. On the vast plains to the north of Crone Mountain, the sound of a bugle horn shook the heavens. Huang Songpu had 12,000 cavalrymen, 14,000 Wanyan elite cavalrymen, and 34,000 second cavalry. Among them, there were also 500 to 600 rare heavy cavalrymen who were fully equipped with armor. The northern Mang cavalry that had been accumulating power and waiting to set out stretched out 5 or 6 li in length, continuing without end. Compared to Bailiang's Liuzhou border army, which only had 30,000 cavalry, Beimang's morale was not inferior. Their military strength was far superior. Commander Huang Songpu did not purposely try to win by surprise. Although the battlefield was vast, this general who had been the #1 person in the Southern Dynasty for more than a decade did not try his best to spread out the front lines. It was obvious that he did not plan to fight a chaotic battle of unprecedented scale. He also did not split into left, middle, and right formations like the Liuzhou border army. Instead, he used his own troops as the vanguard, with the Wanyan elite cavalry following closely behind. The E cavalry, which had the largest number of people, brought up the rear. In this way, the northern Liang border cavalry, who had the advantage of natural armor, could be weakened to the greatest extent. While ensuring the thickness of their formation, it could force the Liuzhou cavalry into the mud and reduce the number of repeated charges. On the other hand, to be able to make the grassland cavalry that was described in the spring and autumn annals as the western and northern borders were filled with fierce cavalry that came and went like the wind, and the central plains were unstoppable unless it was a high city, they had no choice but to use such a stable formation to fight. This in itself showed the exceptional strength of the Bailiang cavalry. Ko Jianghuai and Chen Shiliang stood at the peak of Crone Mountain, their field of vision extremely good. Overlooking the battlefield, they could see that after Liang Mang's cavalry began their charge at the same time, they were like two waves of flood bursting through a dike, colliding into each other. Chen Shiliang had never considered himself to be an expert in military affairs. When facing the battlefield, he also did not have the hot-bloodedness of a general. It could even be said that this talented second-generation Su family strategist of the Tide-Listening Pavilion had an instinctive dislike of killing on the battlefield. The Confucian school advocated cultivating the body, governing the family, and governing the country. The essence, or perhaps the root, lay in the word governing and peace. Therefore, the world was governed and peaceful. This was the true home of a scholar. Chen Shiliang subconsciously turned his head and saw Ko Jianghuai holding his horse with one hand and his blade with the other. His expression was calm. Chen Shiliang was often compared to Su Beiji, who was also a strategist of Mount Qingliang. This was just like how the imperial court of West Chu liked to comment on the twin jade annulus of Dechu, Ko Jianghuai, and Xieshi. It was the same logic as how the West Chu imperial court always liked to comment on the twin jade annulus of Dechu, Ko Jianghuai, and Xieshi. In Bailiang Pass officialdom and the border army outside the pass, Chen Shiliang and the higher-ranked transport envoy Su Beiji were polar opposites. The Bailiang border army recognized Chen Shiliang, who had personally experienced the first great battle of Liang Mang. They believed that Chen Shiliang had truly inherited the mantle of Tide-Listening Pavilion Li Yishan. In the future, he might have a chance to reach a transcendent height that could stand shoulder to shoulder with Li Yishan. However, the officialdom of the three provinces, especially Liangzhou and Lingzhou, where Su Beiji had lived before, regarded Su Beiji even more highly. They viewed him as a true pillar of Beiliang, a talent comparable to Li Yang's Grand Secretary Zhang Julu. He had the stature of a prime minister that could only be achieved by one person in a generation. On the other hand, Chen Shiliang was probably no more than a military strategist at the border or a minister in the central government. Chen Shiliang paid no attention to these comments about the undercurrents of Beiliang's upper echelons. This was because of his temperament. Although he was born into a humble family in Gangnam-do and did not even have the qualifications to sit at the same table as famous scholars, compared to many officials in the Liyang imperial court who seemed to have suddenly turned yellow overnight after passing the imperial examinations, Chen Shiliang was more open-minded. Instead, there were often people who half-jokingly said to him that Su Beiji had a competitive heart. Even the provincial governor Yang Guangdou did not mince his words. Whether a gentleman competed or not depended on the timing. He warned Chen Shiliang that Chen Shiliang could not truly not compete for anything and only give in. As for the twin jade annulus of Dechu, who was currently leading troops and fighting alongside him in Liuzhou, Chen Shiliang felt that he had a slightly better impression of Xie Shibian, who came to Liuzhou later than him. He and this person, one was scholarly and one was martial, but their backgrounds were similar. They were both at the bottom of the marketplace. Moreover, compared to the proud and arrogant Guangling Dao descendant Ko Jianghuai, Xie Shibian was more in line with the image of a scholar as a gentleman. Interacting with him was like bathing in the spring breeze. Ko Jianghuai was always like the blazing sun in the midday summer sky, dazzling and dazzling. But even so, the deeper Chen Shiliang interacted with Ko Jianghuai, the more sincere his admiration for him grew. He remembered reading history when he was young. He read, "One does not rejoice in victory, one does not feel discouraged in defeat. One who is as calm as a lake even when there is a thunderstorm in his chest can become a general." At this time and place in Crone Mountain, Chen Shiliang gazed at Ko Jianghuai's resolute profile. In his heart, he sighed, "A master of the art of war should be like this." Ko Jianghuai did not turn his head. He suddenly said, "If I win this war, but Xie Shibian dies in battle, then to me, Beiliang wins and I lose." Chen Shiliang, who had been immersed in officialdom for many years, naturally understood the mystery. He asked curiously, "Since this is the case, why did Ko Jiangjun agree to General Xie's generosity and go north?" Chapter 1960. Ko Jianghuai smiled and said slowly, "In the Battle of Spring and Autumn at the West Wall, do you know how many cavalrymen were really involved in the battle? Actually, the total was less than 140,000, far less than the 40,000 to 50,000 infantrymen sent in at once in the middle and later stages of the battle. It was because both sides had used up a lot of military strength before the final battle, and the cavalry had suffered heavy casualties early on. It was also because the Guangling Road territory was not suitable for large-scale cavalry to fight together. So, not to mention me and Xie Shibian, even Chao Chongqing and all the people in the Central Plains who use troops will have a knot in their hearts, and that is to have a proper cavalry battle with the grassland cavalry that is said to be invincible after the Great Feng. There is no need to rely on the dangerous pass, no need to defend the city to the death, just on the flat terrain of the battlefield, warhorse against warhorse, warblade against warblade." At this point, Ko Jianghuai paused for a moment. His hands let go of the reins and the handle of the warblade, and he suddenly clenched his fists and smashed them together. "Meet force with force, let's have a proper battle." Ko Jianghuai's eyes were burning. "Victory! Our cavalry of the Central Plains will win." Even Chen Shiliang, a civil official who despised casualties on the battlefield, couldn't help but feel a surge of strong emotions when he heard these words. Ko Jianghuai reached out an arm and pointed at the battlefield at the foot of the mountain where the two armies were about to collide. "Coincidentally, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity is in front of me and Xie Shibian. I want to win, he also wants to win, so no matter what, we can't lose. However, Xie Shibian is more ruthless. For this battle, he is willing to pay the price with his life. I'm not as good as him, and I'm only willing to bear the price of a dark future in Beiliang. An ambitious person values success or failure, and a hero doesn't care about death. Maybe in the history books, Xie Shibian will be praised more than me. Qin Shiliang had nothing to say. On the battlefield to the right of Crone Mountain, the battle between the two sides reached 100,000 cavalry. It was spectacular and tragic. To increase the strength of the formation, the refugee young cavalry in the middle of the three cavalry armies of Liuzhou led the charge with 6,000 men of the direct collision camp, jumping out of the original front line. In the first charge, Huang Songpu did not use the armored cavalry that was worthy of its name. Instead, he hid them outside the battlefield, and it was still the old commander himself who led the elite cavalry under his direct command. It was still this old general who had once been the king of the southern courtyard leading the charge. Abandoning the tactic of luring the enemy and wandering about, the cavalry clashing into the formation was exchanging lives. The 6,000 direct collision battalion acted as the tip of the cone formation. As they accelerated, they gradually reduced the width of their front line and collided with the 12,000 cavalry under Huang Songpu. The Chong of Liuzhou was like a giant drill to cut open a mountain. Including the collision camp, the direct, and the cavalry, and the Bian Bailiang and the cavalry. The deeper they dug into the formation, the easier it was for the two dragon elephant armies at the sides of the conical formation to tear through the northern Meng cavalry's thickness. Huang Songpu's front, middle, and rear formations, in this kind of simple collision formation, displayed an astonishing effect. The 12,000 men led by the old commander were all top elites who had been through many battles. They were originally better than the Liuzhou border cavalry made up of refugees. Both sides separated from each other, advancing 500 steps forward. There were Flo province cavalry soldiers who were continuously knocked off their horses, directly smashing into the 2,000 cavalry at the very front of the camp. 5 or 6 out of 10 died on the spot. Under the continuous collision of this type of cavalry formation, it was often impossible for them to even slow down the northern Meng enemy cavalry. It was to the extent where the northern Meng cavalry didn't even need to deliberately remove their heads, their warhorses could just charge straight through. The 14,000 Wanyan elite cavalry did not follow closely behind Huang Songpu's cavalry. Instead, they opened up a 600 to 700 step gap between the two armies. With that, Wanyan Yinjiang's family private army was able to launch a second charge. When the remaining 7,000 Liuzhou cavalry broke out of the formation of Huang Songpu's cavalry, they faced the Wanyan elite cavalry who had raised their speed to the max. One side's speed and momentum were decreasing, while the other side's momentum was at its peak. The result of the collision was obvious. The 14,000 Wanyan elite cavalry held their spears and charged forward. Relying on the impact of the charge, they were extremely heavy. 500 Liuzhou border cavalry were actually brushed past and died on the backs of their horses. The perfect soldier cavalry at the back even had the time to grab the chance to stab those Liuzhou cavalry who had unfortunately fallen to the ground. When this Liuzhou cavalry that broke through the formation twice finally met the B cavalry with the largest number of people, they had already suffered heavy losses. Luckily, their sacrifice reduced the pressure on the two wings of the Longxiang army. No matter if the wild goose flew north or south, it was always the leading goose that had the most difficulty. It was even more so when the formation on the battlefield was like flying geese. Although the cavalry gathered by the Yi High School had the thickest formation and the longest depth, they did not pose much of a threat to the Liuzhou cavalry. Facing the charge of the Longxiang army, which did not suffer many losses, they were at a disadvantage. It was just a change of battlefield position. Both sides of Liangmang were covered in corpses. However, both sides still maintained a relatively stable formation. This meant that in the next charge, more people would die and it would be easier. Qin Shiliang stood on the mountain peak. After personally witnessing this intense clash, he kept silent. If one only judged from the Old Woman Mountain battlefield, based on the current situation, the final victor would be Beimeng. Ko Jianghuai was expressionless from start to finish. Not enough people had died here, and the northern Meng did not feel that the achievements were at their fingertips. Or, if Huang Songpu sensed that something was wrong, the final encirclement of the Crone Mountain would not be able to stop the main force of the northern Meng at all. After all, this was not the Calabash Pass of Yuzhou that was blessed by nature, and there were no terrifying troops like the Great Snow Dragon Cavalry and the 2 Northern Liang Heavy Cavalry responsible for blocking the retreat. Ko Jianghuai turned his head and looked toward the southeast. Chapter 1961. Northern Liang Path's 2 new relay routes within Lu Province's territory were both horizontal, separately leading to Liang and Ling provinces, far less meticulous than the Pass Inner Province's 3 provinces. This was also a helpless move. The vast Lu province only had 3 military towns to rely on, yet it was bordered by northern Mang's powerful Gusai province. That was why building longitudinal relay routes within Lu province could only make it easier for the grassland cavalry to drive south. This was a move that destroyed one's own border. Taking 10,000 steps back, even if that young vassal king mysteriously lost his head, overestimating his own abilities and exhausting his military, building relay routes in Lu Province, Green Azure City's Provincial Governor Manor, Huaiyang Pass Protectorate Manor and Clear Frost Mountain would all rebel at the same time. The plains on the right side of Crone Mountain was the most suitable terrain for cavalry outside of Qingcang City. The location chosen by Ko Jianghuai for the 3rd intercepting battle after the 2 great victories was a yellow sand plain about 200 li north of Crone Mountain. Between that plain and Crone Mountain, there was a huge corridor running north and south. It was roughly shaped like a woman's waist. If the grassland cavalry were to advance from north to south, although this wasn't a path they had to pass through to reach the battlefield of Crone Mountain, compared to taking a detour, it could shorten the distance by 60 li. Furthermore, this corridor wasn't narrow or steep, definitely not a winding path. It was impossible to set up an ambush on both sides. On the contrary, the mountains on both sides of the corridor were flat. The width of the corridor was roughly the same, about 1.5 li. It could be said that a large group of cavalry could pass through it without any hindrance. The so-called corridor was shaped like a woman's waist, but that was only in comparison to the entire Liuzhou territory. As a result, from the first battle of Liangmang, when Lu Wei's cavalry went south, to the second battle of Ko Jianghuai, when the 3 intercepting battles, neither side had set their eyes on this place that the refugees had named Grasshopper's Leg. However, amidst the grandiose reinforcement of the 50,000 southern border cavalry, when almost everyone could see the northern entrance of this corridor, there was already a group of Lu province soldiers in the middle of the corridor. They had been waiting for a long time. When Ma Lanzi hurriedly reported back to the Beimang generals, the 50,000 cavalry fell into an awkward situation. The Liuzhou infantry all assumed a posture of defending the corridor to the death. There were about 14,000 of them. The main force was the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain in the west, mixed in with 2,000 to 3,000 native Liuzhou soldiers. The bad news was that with this corridor as the battlefield, the cavalry couldn't move left and right. The good news was that the infantry army that was waiting in formation didn't bring any large-scale anti-horse machine. Once the cavalry army that already had the absolute advantage in terms of military strength smashed through the infantry army and forced them to retreat in panic, forget about 17,000 to 18,000 infantry, even if their military strength was doubled, it still wouldn't be enough for this cavalry army to cut down with their blades. After 20 years of fighting to the death at the border, the northern Mang Southern Dynasty cavalry no longer dared to underestimate the strength of the northern Liang cavalry or the Yuzhou infantry under Yan Wenwan's command. However, if it was any other troop, they really wouldn't think much of it. This wasn't blind arrogance, but rather the enormous confidence that the grassland cavalry had accumulated over the past 400 years since the end of the Great Feng Dynasty's era. Apart from this, the reason that made the southern generals feel troubled was that from the moment they left the camp to the battlefield at Crone Mountain, whether it was the king's tent in Baiding, the nearby temple in Shijing, or the commander-in-chief Huang Songpu, who was fighting in the south, they were all strictly ordered to participate in the battle on time. At the crucial moment, the entire battle would be decided and all the main forces in Liuzhou would be wiped out. Thus, the 50,000 cavalry could not miss the opportunity at all. Right now, the difficult problem facing these southern dynasty generals who grasped military authority wasn't just whether or not they should take a longer detour, because the monk soldiers in the middle of the corridor could similarly quickly withdraw to the south. Perhaps if they changed the battlefield, the northern Mang cavalry could break through the formations even faster, but the consumption of traveling 60 li of additional distance was definitely not a price these southern dynasty generals, large and small, could endure. Moreover, the military merit of more than 10,000 Western region monk soldiers, especially Xie Shibian, whose head might be exchanged for the merit of being granted a noble rank, was just too tempting. Should they fight or not? Of course they would. Whether it was for public or private reasons, the Beimang cavalry felt that they had to fight in this corridor to obtain a large amount of military merit. The 18 Xianbei jade belts that the emperor had recently bestowed to the Wanyan family were the best example. With great merit in front of them, how could the 50,000 cavalry, whose stamina and spirit were at their peak, not be able to break through the formation of more than 10,000 infantry soldiers? On the other side of the corridor, Xie Shibian, wearing armor and a war blade at his waist, sat on the back of a horse and looked toward the north. The wind blew in his face, and it was as if he could already smell the scent of blood. This deputy general of Liuzhou, who was known as one of Dechu's twin jade annulus, had a firm gaze and a calm expression. Chao Zhangqing had once privately commented with the empress of West Chu, Jiangxi, about the generals and ministers of the dynasty. Most of them were mediocre, but when it came to Xie Shibian's proud disciple, he was unexpectedly not stingy with his praises. Especially when he said, using troops on the battlefield, turning stone into gold. These 8 words carried the most weight. But in the end, he added a comment that seemed to be a digression. Xie Shibian's tenacity and perseverance surpasses Ko Jiangwai's. Xie Shibian slowly closed his eyes. This young man that even the young emperor of Liang wanted to recruit into Great Peace City was now a citizen of Dechu but a general of Beiliang. Dechu had been invincible for 200 years during the spring and autumn period. They relied on 3 things to defeat their enemies: strong armor, strong bows, long spears, and military orders. When Dechu was at the peak of its power, it had once beaten Liang and Dongyu to the north of the country like a strong man beating a young child. Even though Great Chu's military strength had declined from its peak, and Liang, located in the northern corner of the 9 kingdoms of spring and autumn, had begun to pay attention to cultivating cavalry, before the 120,000 great halberd warriors were completely wiped out in the Battle of Scenic River. The entire Central Plains still believed that the Liang cavalry of a certain scale would not be able to gain the slightest advantage against the heavily armored infantry that was hailed as the most powerful in history. However, in the Battle of Scenic River, reality had proven that on a suitable battlefield, heavily armored infantry that did not have enough cavalry supporting them could only wait for death no matter how many there were. They might not necessarily lose, but they definitely would not obtain a great victory. That classic battle in the history books was far inferior to the one at West Leby. It had always been underestimated and looked down upon by Li Yang's historians and militarists. First of all, in the 3 battles, not many soldiers actually died on both sides, only 30,000. Second, the Su family army that had achieved a great victory with the combination of cavalry and infantry chose to brutally bury more than 80,000 surrendered soldiers in order to prevent any mistakes in the crucial battle that followed. In addition, the old emperor of Liang, Zhao Li, had once sent an old general with meritorious service and 2 Zhao clan relatives to participate in the battle. Therefore, it was inconvenient for Zhao Dun to spread the taboo of ascending the throne and claiming the title of venerable. However, that battle of Jinghe had a great impact on the victorious Su family. When Su Shao and his subordinates were touring the battlefield, he squatted down and stared at the fine armor of a Dechu halberd soldier. Long sabers hacked and spears stabbed, but it was still mostly intact. He sighed. The person is already dead, but the armor is still intact. If I had armor like this, how many people would die? We can't continue to be so poor. Chapter 1962. From then on, the Su family, who only wanted military merit and not silver, every time they broke through a city or camp, they began to secretly seize the weapons and gold. Countless Liang officials criticized them for stuffing their own pockets. This was not an unjust accusation. Of course, Su Shao never denied this. Especially at the end of the Battle of the Western Wall, Su Shao made a rebellious move. It was precisely because of this that most of the incense between the Su and Zhao families died. Su Shao issued a secret order to his subordinate, Cavalry General Su Pu, and his two adopted sons, Chen Zhibao and Yuan Zuozong. The three of them worked together and successfully allowed the Su family to secretly gather 10,000 soldiers and horses. They took the lead in breaking through West Chu's capital before the Li Yang selected candidates. Afterwards, they wantonly searched for all the treasures and gold that could be carried away in chests. Su Zhao's famous sentence, "Shit tastes good, but it doesn't taste good," came from after the plundering. When the Li Yang military sent an envoy to denounce him, lame Su got straight to the point. "The things are already in my stomach. If you want them, I can only give you shit. Do you want to eat it?" It was said that when the old emperor, Zhao Li, heard this report, he was so angry that he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. In the end, Su Shao just symbolically spat out some spoils of war to the imperial army and left the matter unsettled. After being granted the title of king and vassal of the northwest border, Su Zhao's obsession with weapons and horses could be said to have become even more intense. Rather than saying that the Bailiang cavalry was the best in the world, it was better to say that the army and horses were the best in the world. In these 20 years, the smuggling of ironware to the Beimang grasslands and the endless border of Liyang never stopped despite repeated prohibitions. The two Bailiang border armies, who enjoyed half of the country's taxes, constantly made small movements that were extremely difficult to stop. It wasn't until Chen Zhibao temporarily served as the former Minister of War and Gu Jiantang left the capital to personally oversee the north that the two most powerful generals in the military worked closely together on this matter that they succeeded. Even in the Bailiang Frontier Army, which had strict military law, there were still several captains with real power who were beheaded on the spot because of this. The implications were broad, from the generals inside the pass to the generals with real power outside the pass, to the captains of the pass, and finally to the big and small beacons. Often, close to 100 heads would fall in one incident. The grassland cavalry had never lacked horses, but they lacked armor. After the old lady ascended the throne, Beimang's outlook had changed greatly. Borrowing the momentum of Hongjia's rush to the north, the entire country, from top to bottom, from the iron smelting technique to the military equipment, was the same. However, there were some things that were deeply ingrained in the nomads. Even after 20 years of influence, it was still difficult to change. For example, the Chang cavalry that was destroyed in the northwest of Liuzhou, the famous Beimang Southern Dynasty's Chang cavalry, and the Ruan cavalry that Hong Jingyan led, were known as the most important border cavalry. With the old lady's foresight and the importance of the Southern Dynasty's Xijing imperial court, how could she not have the foundation and courage to equip 10,000 Chang cavalry with good equipment? However, the Chang cavalry maintained the light cavalry path of leather armor, fast horses, short knives, and short spears. This couldn't be simply seen as a sectarian bias of the Beimang cavalry. It was more of the times that made heroes. The sound of the hooves of the Beimang cavalry became louder and louder. Added to the natural echo of the corridor, and the roar of the Beimang after they thought that victory was in their grasp, it was like a thunderclap on the ground. The momentum was extremely majestic. Xie Shibian suddenly opened his eyes and pulled out the cold knife at his waist. He shouted angrily, "Formation! Barricade the horse!" This time, using the infantry formation to stop the 50,000 Beimang cavalry, Xie Shibian had the right to distribute 5,000 bows and crossbows from the Liuzhou provincial governor's mansion. He also asked for 800 horse lances and 1,000 mo knives from the Liangzhou border army. The mo knife was popular in the southern Tang during the spring and autumn period. It weighed more than 50 caddies and was made of fine iron. Only the best soldiers in the army could wield it. In the past, the southern Tang border had 16 towns and more than 70,000 soldiers and horses. There were only about 2,000 mo knife soldiers. They were so strong that they were once hailed as the king of white blades. It was believed that if they could gather 10,000 mo knives to guard the country's gate, they could stop 100,000 invading cavalry. After the first famous general in the old southern Tang, Gu Dezhu, followed the then heir of Bailiang, Su Fengyan, into Bailiang, in addition to being the deputy commander of the infantry, with the full support of the young feudal lord, He earnestly asked Gu Dezhu to help the Mahist Jizi create a new type of mo knife so that it could be given to the Bailiang border army in the future. Compared to the 50 caddies mo knife of the southern Tang soldiers in history, because the men of Bailiang were more robust and had greater strength, the well-deserved Zamadeo of Bailiang was heavier. The Mahist Jizi, Song Changsui, jokingly named it Knife 60. It was a pity that they started to make it before the First Liang-Mang War. Until now, they had only tried their best to make 1,000 of them. Moreover, it was difficult to use them on the battlefield outside Liangzhou Pass. Then, Xie Shibian asked for all of them. Other than that, there were also the 1,000 long lances. These lances were more expensive to make than the mo knife. The degree of rarity was enough to make people speechless. Only the son of a military family could use a horse lance. This was an iron law since the birth of the horse lance. First, no matter if it was a horse lance or a horse lance, it was extremely long and difficult to use. Ordinary cavalry using it would be like drawing legs on a snake. Second, it took a long time to make. It was said that it took at least 3 years to make a lance. It had always been the #1 hobby of the cavalry of the Central Plains. It was even harder to find than a good horse that was worth thousands of gold. The young feudal lord personally ordered the 800 lances. It was a number that almost took all of the Su family's wealth to gather. If it were not for the fact that the Bailiang military law did not allow cavalry to use lances because of their status, and that Su Shao, who was used to living a hard life and was afraid of being poor, had the intention to wantonly collect lances from the military depot during the later stages of the Spring and Autumn War, it would be wishful thinking. In the corridor, the Liuzhou infantry formed by the monk soldiers of Mount Lantua blocked the horse. At the very front were the lances pointing outwards. The cold light was like snow. 300 people formed a horizontal line, forming 3 rows. The first row held lances and knelt, their lances slanted forward. The second row held their lances flat and pointed forward. The third row held their lances on the shoulders of the soldiers in front, also slanted forward. In front of the 3 rows of lances, there were actually 2 rows of sturdy monk soldiers holding their huge shields with their hands and shoulders. After the lances, there were 4 rows of tall monk soldiers with 200 people in each row, holding mo swords that could kill 800 horses. The battle was imminent. The 800 people sat on the ground to rest. Even when the Baimang cavalry blew the horn to charge, without the order of the general, the 800 mo swordsmen still could not get up. They had to save as much strength as possible. Once the lances and horses were all killed, the 800 mo swordsmen would charge forward like a wall. Great ancestor Gu once said that in front of the mo sword of southern Tang, men and horses would be crushed. After this, there were 2,000 Liuzhou border soldiers and 3,000 monks from Mount Lantua, equipped with 5,000 bows and crossbows. When the infantry formation faced the enemy cavalry, the first to stop the cavalry charge was actually the 5,000 archers at the back of the formation. After Xie Shibian gave the order to stop the horse, he did not continue to stop at the back of the infantry formation. Instead, he walked behind the archers and took down the shield hanging from the saddle. Then, he held a blade in one hand and a shield in the other, standing at the front of the infantry formation formed by the remaining monk soldiers. The Baimang cavalry roared like thunder, and the Liuzhou infantry formation was as silent as a mountain. Life and death were decided in this unknown corridor. In the history books of the future, whether it was heavily exaggerated or lightly described, without exception, they would conclude this battle with 6 battles and 6 defeats. The fierceness of the battle could not be described in more words. Chapter 1963. After Northern Mang became the imperial preceptor of this dynasty under the decree of peace, they were no longer the same as they were in the past when it came to attacking huge cities and towns that were difficult for warhorses to leap over. In the first great battle of Liang Mang, Dong Zhuo broke through the #1 town at the border of Liang, Hutu City. Zhong Tan Lian broke through Yozhou's Huluku City, Krugong City, and Wanhe City. Not only that, the grassland cavalry who aspired to annex the Central Plains had also studied deeply on how to break through the dense infantry formation. Chuanji Bo Tuoba Chi Yun was even more knowledgeable in this field. Before he officially joined the army, during the meeting between the monarch and the minister, He specialized in discussing the battle of cavalry and infantry. He spoke eloquently and in detail, making the northern Mang Empress, who was familiar with military affairs, exclaim in admiration. Under the promotion of the Taiping commandery, almost every generals of the Southern Dynasty would have 1 or 2 military advisors from the pivotal hall of Shijing. Most of these people were young, who were brought to the Southern Dynasty by Hongjia. They could be considered as the 3rd generation of scholars after their families took root in the grassland. There were also young and strong Shuiwei who came from the Norland of the grassland, but there were not many of them. Most of the generals of the Southern Dynasty sneered at them and regarded them as the military supervisors. In fact, there were some top nobles in the Southern Dynasty who were willing to pay attention to this group of young people. General Yang Yuanzun, who had died in the battle at Hoku City in Yuzhou. At that time, Yang Yuanzan brought a large number of young talents from the pivotal hall of Shijing. There were as many as 100 of them, but they were all turned into piles of bones. Although the old lady finally exchanged Lu Jinu's body in Huda City for several heads, including Yang Yuanzan's, she showed a rare stingy and mean attitude about Yang Yuanzan's posthumous title after he died on the battlefield. She did not even give a token order to appease the Yangs. It was said that the emperor even pointed at the head of the old general in the lime box and said to the Taiping commandery standing beside her that Yang Yuanzan deserved to die for destroying her 10 years of foundation. When the 5 generals of the Southern Dynasty met to discuss whether to fight this battle or not, a pivotal hall of Shijing with a low rank suggested to divide the army into 2 groups based on Ma Lang's description. 30,000 cavalrymen would attack the corridor and 20,000 cavalrymen would go south to help the Crone Mountain. Only one of the 5 Beimang generals from different military towns agreed. The other 4 rejected this overly conservative proposal. The middle-aged general from Maolong military town was known for his violent character in the Southern Dynasty. He directly bent over and pointed his whip at the young man's nose, scolded him for being a kid who didn't even know how to speed was the most important thing in war. How could he know the importance of war? Be quick. He also asked the young man in a strange tone, "Are you a spy planted in the Southern Dynasty by the Bailiang Frontier Army?" The only old general who agreed with the young man's cautious proposal couldn't bear it. Just as he was about to say something to smooth things over, he heard the other 3 generals, who had similar positions and more power, laugh out loud. The men of the grassland, especially the strong in the army, always believed that they could be killed but not humiliated. The young man whose father had died in battle outside Bailiang was so angry that his eyes turned red. He almost ground his teeth to pieces. In the end, he took the initiative to ask to be the vanguard of the cavalry. Before he left, he sneered and said, "After I die, I'll see how you die in the underworld." The 4 ambitious generals didn't care at all. The young man who had read a few tattered books and didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth wanted to die. They, who had no relationship with him, couldn't be bothered to stop him. However, after the 2,000 vanguard cavalry ran into a wall, all of the generals began to realize that the situation wasn't good. It wasn't that they didn't understand the natural mobility brought by abandoning the warhorses. It wasn't easy to use cavalry to break through the infantry formation head-on. The cavalry who opened the way would inevitably die when they ran into the formation. However, even the oldest generals didn't expect the infantry formation's defense to be so shocking. If it was said that the 5,000 infantrymen hiding behind the horse barricade formation shot out arrows like a torrential downpour, it was still within reason. However, there were still more than 1,000 of the 2,000 cavalrymen who charged behind the wall. The bloody scene of both men and horses dying in an instant was still extremely shocking to the captains, who had seen many bloody battlefields. These 2,000 elite cavalrymen were undoubtedly 2,000 men of sacrifice. Almost everyone knew that they would die if they charged forward, so they began to accelerate at the edge of the range of the crossbows. When the 1,000 or so cavalrymen crashed into the horse barricade formation, their momentum was actually the strongest and their speed was the fastest. When a single cavalryman crashed into the horse barricade formation, relying on the inertia brought by the galloping warhorses, the terrifying impact was self-evident. In the end, more than 1,000 men of sacrifice, men and horses, all died under the long spears. No less than 600 warhorses were directly pierced through by the long spears. The most terrifying thing was that the second group of cavalry was almost visible to the naked eye. Those strangely long spears displayed incredible toughness. After piercing through the warhorse corpses, most of the spears only bent and didn't break before they were pulled out of the corpses. For example, the normal cavalry of the Southern Dynasty's border army was usually given a cavalry spear. Often, it would break after 1 or 2 charges. Only the elite soldiers under the direct command of great generals like Dong Zhuo, Liu Ge, and Yang Yuanzhan were able to repeatedly ram into the formation without breaking. However, as the grassland cavalry who were familiar with archery and horses, they all knew that even the Winter Thunder elite cavalry under the command of Orange Province's sectional magistrate Murong Baoding's spears were not as unreasonable as the spears in the hands of the Liuzhou monk infantry army. Although these 2,000 cavalrymen were a little timid, before the horn of retreat sounded behind them, no one dared to turn around and retreat. It wasn't that these cavalrymen didn't care about their lives, nor were they completely unafraid of death. Although the border army of the Southern Dynasty was not as strict as the Baoyang Su family, if they retreated at the last minute, not only would they implicate their superiors, but also their whole family. They really couldn't be timid. As the 2,000 cavalrymen were charging, the Liuzhou infantry army in their sight slowly moved back more than 10 steps. The shield formation was still like a wall, the infantry spears were still like a forest, and the arrows were still like rain. The young Shijing advisor who died on the battlefield when he was 20 years old happened to be hanging on a slanted infantry spear before the infantry army retreated. It was like a scarlet sugar-coated haw, both funny and tragic. Before he died, his chest and the head of his mount were pierced through by the infantry spear. The young man used all his strength to reach out and hold onto the infantry spear. The corner of his mouth twitched as if he wanted to say something, but he couldn't open his mouth. If he could return alive, he would definitely insist on taking a detour to the south. He would tell the 5 generals of the border army who mistakenly thought that a great achievement was at their fingertips that this thing was called a long spear. The shaft was extremely tough, the grip was extremely strong, and the tip was extremely sharp. When the sharp knife and heavy axe struck, there would be the sound of metal and stone. It would never crack or break. It had always been the white blade and the sharpest weapon that countless cavalry generals in the Central Plains dreamed of. The Han family of Jizhou, who had been competing with the grassland cavalry army for nearly 400 years, always had the tradition of taking the spear after the death of the father. This meant that a good spear that was hard to break was far more suitable to be a family heirloom than a good knife that could cut through iron like mud. Killing the enemy on horseback with a long spear in hand was always successful. The cavalry general who held the spear almost didn't have to worry about the force of the spear hurting his arm. How bad could it be to use the infantry formation to stop the horses? The second wave of 2,000 cavalry still didn't survive, but in the end, the infantry formation was loosened. Hundreds of cavalry crashed into the first row of Liuzhou monk soldiers with shields and died with blood splattering everywhere. In total, more than 300 lances of the 1,000 paces had been broken. The poet of the Great Feng Dynasty once wrote a border fortress poem that had been passed down to this day. It described the outstanding military exploits of a famous general at the border, but in front of the battle, he was defeated by the enemy. This sentence was simple and straightforward, but it was also very vivid. The word, defeated, was the finishing touch. One of the generals sitting on horseback couldn't help but raise his butt and look at the battlefield in the distance. He was dumbfounded and couldn't say a single word. They weren't afraid of dying, but if they died so quickly, how could they fight the war? Even if it were 2 cavalry armies fighting, how long would it take to charge and break through the enemy's formation with a short 300 paces? The generals of the Maolong army, who had previously mocked the staff of the Cardinal Hall of Shijing, secretly swallowed his saliva. He turned his head stiffly and said to the old generals, "Should we leave this place and take a 60-mile detour to Laohu Mountain?" The old general, who actually only had 6,000 cavalry under him, shook his head and said in a deep voice, "The most difficult thing for a cavalry to break an infantry formation is at the beginning. This Liuzhou monk soldiers' barricade is the most powerful, causing us to suffer heavy losses. This is reasonable. I believe that as long as we break through those few rows of spears, the rest will be much smoother. Chapter 1964. The faces of the other captains were uncertain. The old general calmly said, "Although it's not that we can't split up the troops to go to the Crone Mountain battlefield, or even withdraw the entire army from this place and take a detour to the south, I feel that the northern Liang border army must be plotting something on the Crone Mountain battlefield, or they are afraid that we will encircle them. In any case, the fastest way for us to pass through this corridor is the best choice. How can there be no deaths in a war? Let me be the one leading the charge next." This old general used to be a centurion under Huang Songpu with mediocre intelligence. After Huang Songpu left the army and entered the imperial court in the western capital, he was promoted step by step until he became the king of the southern courtyard. Only then did the old general rise in status and become the head of a medium-sized military town in the hinterland of Gusai state. Unlike the other 4 captains who secretly received boxes of gold and silver before they went to war, the old general rejected the invitation of the 3 second-class noble sects. However, he volunteered to go to the Crone Mountain. Since he was not here for money in the eyes of outsiders, it was probably because he was old but not old at heart. When the 4 generals saw the old general urging his horse forward, the Maolong army cavalry was stunned. "Old general, are you going to break the formation yourself?" The white-haired old general turned around and smiled faintly. "Many of my men are about the same age as my grandson. As the main general of a town, of course I have to." One of the young generals frowned and interrupted the old man's words. "Old general, according to the military law of the border, the main general must die in battle. Once he is defeated, all the Kiliarchs and centurions will be executed." The old general dismissed it with a smile and glanced at the infantry formation in the south corridor. "To open this formation, 6,000 cavalry is definitely not enough. The 8,000 men in my town who are not afraid of death have already followed me here." Perhaps these were the old man's last words. The 6,000 cavalry split into 3 groups and began to charge one after another. After 2 heroic charges, they finally broke through Liuzhou's shield and lance formations. The old general took the lead, his entire body bathed in blood. He crashed into the 800 mo sabers. The monk soldiers wielding Bailiang's special Modeo were the strongest among the monk soldiers of Mount Landoa. Furthermore, they were clad in iron armor over their kasayas. They moved forward in formation and brandished their sabers to chop down the horses. Their speed was unparalleled. Including the old general, 1,200 cavalry died under the Mo saber, which appeared for the first time on the battlefield of Liangmang. The Beimang cavalry was defeated in one battle and defeated again in another battle. The Old Woman Mountain battlefield had already experienced 2 mutual chiseling formations. Out of the 10,000 cavalry in Lu province, only 4,000 remained. Of the 6,000 cavalry in the newly built direct crash battalion, there were less than 1,500. In terms of casualties, the 2 wings of the Longxiang army suffered fewer casualties, with 13,000 of them still able to fight. The Beimang South conquering army led by Huang Songpu had 60,000 cavalry at the start. At this moment, there were still 48,000 cavalry on horseback. This seemingly superior exchange of cavalry was what the Beimang teacher looked forward to the most. Liuzhou battlefield, a small loss for the main force of the South conquering army, is a great victory. If there were no accidents, after 2 more such exchanges, the Longxiang army that had reached 30,000 men at its peak and the direct crash battalion that had just raised their camp flag would become a thing of the past. Lu province's main general Ko Jianghuai, who stood at the peak of Old Woman Mountain from beginning to end, in this type of extremely grim situation, didn't change the formation at all. He only sent someone to pass down the order for the 3,000 cavalry under the command of the provincial governor's manor that was originally outside the battlefield to follow the main force that returned to their original positions after the 2 chiseling attacks, to enter the formation behind Chi Fulong Pass and participate in the 3rd round of attacks. Huang Songpu also ordered the 500 to 600 heavy cavalry to prepare to enter the battlefield. The old commander's only worry was that the battle had reached such a stage. On the Beimang side, the Liuzhou cavalry had suffered heavy casualties, while on his side, the Wanyan elite cavalry under his command had suffered even more casualties than the B cavalry. If not for this, he would not even use the heavy cavalry that was originally used to take the head of either Ko Jianghuai or Su Longxiang. Chen Shiliang could not help but ask, if we charge again, the Liuzhou cavalry will only exist in name. Ko Jiangjun, shouldn't we slow down? Ko Jianghuai shook his head and said, we cannot slow down. At this stage, it is a matter of one breath. Let alone the fact that Yuan Nanting's White Feather Light Cavalry and Ning Amei's Iron Stupa cannot hurry to Old Woman Mountain for now, even if they can immediately enter the battlefield, I will have the Liuzhou Cavalry and Long Xiang Army charge 2 more times. Otherwise, even if the monk soldiers on the western border can stop the 50,000 southern reinforcements, with Huang Songpu's ability, at least 20,000 cavalry will be able to escape. Once they meet up with the remaining cavalry on the northern corridor, our previous 3 battles, including this one, will have been for nothing. It is even equivalent to me, Ko Jianghuai, dragging the 3 armies of Qingyuan Army Town into the quagmire that is Liuzhou. Chen Shiliang sighed and did not continue to speak. Ko Jianghuai suddenly turned his head and said softly, during the Battle of Phoenix Army Town, the defending general used the Liuzhou provincial governor's office to publicly impeach Xie Shibian. You wrote, not against military law, but against reason. I want to thank you. Ko Jianghuai's words were very direct and clear. He wanted to say goodbye to Liuzhou and thank him, not to thank the western frontier. In reality, although Xie Shibian's neutral and peaceful comments were not as harsh as provincial governor Yang Guangdou's, it was still not beneficial to Xie Shibian, who was at the heart of the storm at the time. However, the truth was the opposite. Chen Shiliang, who already had a certain amount of weight in the Beiliang frontier army, was intentionally protecting the Liuzhou deputy general who had angered the public. Once his words sided with Xie Shibian, it would only provoke a fierce backlash from the Liangzhou cavalry and the entire Yuzhou infantry. At that time, it would be extremely difficult for the young feudal lord to personally protect Xie Shibian. In the end, once Xie Shibian became a rat crossing the street in the eyes of the Beiliang frontier army, then not only Ko Jianghuai, who was also a young man and a foreigner, but even Yu Luandao, who had won the approval of the Beiliang frontier army, would be implicated. Chen Shiliang smiled bitterly and shook his head. He said emotionally, this situation was created by the efforts of the prince. No need to thank me. If you really want to thank me, next time go to Beijing to thank the prince. Ko Jianghuai curled his lips. Why should I thank him? Since he is the king of Beiliang, these are the things he should do. The next time I go to Beijing, I will be kind if I don't ask him to be the commander-in-chief of the Beiliang cavalry. Ko Jianghuai suddenly said self-deprecatingly, but I don't think I can beat Yuan Baixiong. This is the bad thing about being in Beiliang. The people who lead the army to war are fiercer than the other. There are so many martial arts grandmasters. Before, when I was in Guangling, my swordsmanship was passable. I was confident in fighting in the court. Now I can't. With a heavy heart, Chen Shiliang finally smiled a little. The two looked around. On the battlefield of Crone Mountain, the commander-in-chief of the Long Xiang army, Su Longxiang, had killed 300 enemies. This was under the premise that he ensured the charging formation of the cavalry. If he did not care about anything else and went all out to kill, the commander-in-chief of the Beimeng cavalry would probably collapse. Ko Jianghuai's gaze shifted to the B cavalry formation, which had the largest number of enemies. He smiled coldly and muttered to himself, I will kill them after I fatten them up. 3 cavalry armies entered the battlefield of Liuzhou. Among them, the general of Liangzhou, Shi Fu, led the 8,000 cavalry of the Qingyuan army. They did not go to Crone Mountain. Instead, they went straight to the corridor. They were not there to save people, but to stop the southern Beimeng cavalry that continued south through the corridor. There might be 30,000 or 20,000. From Shi Fu's point of view, Xie Shibian and the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain would definitely die. Ning Amei's Iron Stupa had suffered heavy losses in the Dragon Eye Plain. However, the young lord had allocated all 800 white horses to the Iron Stupa. He even ordered all the generals of the 4th rank and above outside the Liangzhou Pass to transfer their personal guards. That was how the Iron Stupa recovered to 4,000 riders in just 1 month. With a big halberd in his hand, Ningame led the 4,000 iron cavalry to gallop wildly. He wanted to take a shortcut from the rear, straight to the area between the Old Woman Mountain and the corridor in the north. If the stone talisman was to block the Southern Dynasty's side cavalry's route to the south, then he needed to cut off the Huang Songpu's main forces' route of retreat to the north. The last cavalry was a light cavalry in the absolute sense, full of elegance. Every one of them carried bows and light crossbows, with quivers of arrows hanging on both sides of the saddle and only a northern cold saber hanging from their waists. The arrows that peeked out of the quivers were white like 2 balls of snow. When the horses galloped, it was very beautiful. The main general, Yuan Nanting, led 20,000 white feather light cavalry straight to Crone Mountain. Think about it, when the wind rises, a round of concentrated fire from 20,000 cavalry would be like a majestic downpour, 20,000 raindrops falling on the enemy's head. The 8,000 elite cavalry that had already entered Gusai Prefecture suddenly turned around and went south. They passed through the border, drawing a diagonal arc as they galloped towards the corridor battlefield. A short and tired young general kept praying in his heart, "Don't die, don't die." They all say that you can't do anything more than 3 times. Even if you count the Battle of Miyun Pass, you have only done it twice. King Yama will definitely not be willing to accept you. If others want to die, I don't care. But you, Xie Shibian, are the only one who wants to die. I have to beat you up. This person was Chao Wei. His nickname was Chao Benlei. Chapter 1965. The manor of Beifang was shrouded in a heavy atmosphere. Other than the 140,000 private soldiers under Dong Zhuo to surround Huayang Pass, he had also persuaded the Emperor of Beimang to mobilize 20,000 refugees who had lost their identities in the grasslands to participate in the assault on the outer walls of Huayang Pass. The insane Dong Zhuo had declared that he would use corpses to build a gentle slope to the top of the wall. The left and right cavalry led by Lu Dian and Li Yanchao had engaged in a series of small skirmishes with the vanguard of the Winter Thunder elite cavalry and the Ruren cavalry. Finally, a major battle had begun. On the 2 battlefields, Liang Mang's 4 cavalry armies had invested a total of 40,000 soldiers. Evidently, neither side had mobilized their full strength. The strength of the Beimang's Winter Thunder elite cavalry was unexpected, and the Ruren cavalry of 10,000 could not be underestimated either. Compared to the situation before Beifang, the casualties of the left and right cavalry armies were slightly greater. This meant that once they were entangled by the soldiers of Beimang, it would be very difficult for them to escape. Once this main force of Beiliang lost the flexibility of large-scale battlefield movements, other than the 10,000 great snow dragon cavalry that could still fight and retreat, the 2 heavy cavalry armies that were destined to be unable to participate in large-scale battles alone would fall into an awkward situation. On the other hand, the middle army of Beimang, after the second battle line that Wang Yong and Helian Wei had built together, there was still a crown prince who was personally leading the troops. Beside this Beimang, who was second only to one person and above tens of thousands of people, other than the Palace Iron Cavalry Chieshui army that rarely appeared on the battlefield, there were also 2 heavy cavalry armies named after the surnames of Yelu and Murong. The battle strength of the heavy cavalry was indeed terrifying, but they greatly relied on the large-scale main force of the cavalry. This was like the 2-sleeved green snake of the sword god Li Chungang. It needed the support of a vast amount of qi, otherwise it would be a flashy dragon-slaying technique. This was the difficulty of the Beiliang Frontier Army resisting the entire army of Beimang. If the Beimang Frontier Army could send out another 100,000 cavalry soldiers, then the Beimang Frontier Army would definitely not choose Beiliang as the route south to the Central Plains. They would directly turn around and head towards the border between Liyang and Liao to fight to the death with Gu de Zhugua. They would even have the strength to send troops to Jizhou and follow the path that the grassland cavalry were most familiar with to enter the hinterland of the Central Plains. Or they could turn east and reach Taiyan City. However, in this way, the situation in the world would not be as simple as the Beiliang cavalry lying on the side of the bed behind the Beimang cavalry. Instead, it would be leisurely watching the fire burning on the other side of the river, patiently waiting to reap the benefits of the fishermen. At that time, whether the Central Plains and the grassland would be surnamed Zhao or Murong would depend on the mood of the young king. Perhaps he might even change his surname to Su. In the study room next to the second hall signing room, it was noon and the sun was high in the sky. It was unbearably hot. As a result, Chancellor Wang, Yang Xianxia, and Baiyu were gathered in the small study room. Other than the deputy Jidushi Yang Xianxia who came to discuss military affairs, the rest of the people came here openly to escape from the heat. Although this study room was small, it was only the young vassal king who was dealing with official affairs. Although the 6 subjects' wing room was big, there were more than 10 or 20 people gathered together. The most important thing was that the administrator Li Daren had ingeniously helped to transplant a loquat tree in the courtyard outside the study room. The loquat tree was of moderate height. It had shade and would not block the light too much. Therefore, the small study room had unknowingly become an excellent summer resort. When Yang Xianxia was discussing with the young vassal king, behind the spring and autumn period old general who was banished to the northwest border by Li Yang, Mr. White Lotus was sitting on a chair near the window and gently swaying his palm leaf fan. The cool breeze blew gently. Chancellor Wang shamelessly pulled Li Gongda to set up a battle array. After a round of beating, he could also rub against the cool breeze brought by Yu's fan. The young vassal king had already browsed through the detailed military intelligence reports. Today, Yang Xianxia didn't come here to repeat the same old tune, but rather because there was an enormous problem in front of North Jiebei City, or perhaps all of northern Liang's northern Liang border army. Qingyuan Army's Stone Talisman Tribes Cavalry, Iron Stupa and White Feather Light Cavalry, these 3 cavalry armies, as the most important mobile military forces outside of Liangzhou's pass, had already moved to Old Woman Mountain in Liuzhou. In that case, if the left and right cavalry failed to successfully devour Murong Baoding's main force of 60,000 elite cavalry and were tightly bitten down by Wang Yong and Helian Wei, these 2 northern Mang's military commanders, what should North Jiebei City do? It could even be said that this risky deployment of troops was very likely to lead to a tragic ending of mutual destruction between the 2 sides of Liang Mang. The main force of Huang Song's Pu tribe was destroyed in Laowu Mountain, but Beiliang would also lose the front line of Huayang Pass. Yang Xianxia worriedly said, "At that time, we did not expect that when Yu Luandao led the army to attack Xijing, Chao Wei's 10,000 cavalry also made a gesture of supporting Yu Luandao's Yu Qi to the north. But Beimang unexpectedly only transferred the cavalry of Bo Wang Jingchong from the eastern front, which was confronting the 2 Liao's Liao, and then did not make any move. It seemed that they did not care about the safety of the southern dynasty's capital region. In the end, they even ordered the army to go south to reinforce Laowu Mountain. Could it be that the old lady has lost her mind and really does not care about the smoke of war rising in the entire Gusai prefecture? You have to know that Gusai prefecture borders 2 prefectures to the north. It has always been lacking in military strength, but it has a well-developed courier route. Once we win Laowu Mountain and join forces with Yu Luandao and Chao Wei's cavalry, Beimang is going to give away half of the southern dynasty with both hands? Su Fengnian did not dare to jump to conclusions. He only smiled bitterly and said, if it were the Liang emperor who cherishes his reputation, he would not dare to do so. If it were that old lady, it would be hard to say. Yang Xianxia frowned. Who will lose and who will gain by such an exchange? Is Beimang not afraid that our cavalry will destroy the southern dynasty, and they will not be able to recover their strength in 10 years and go south to the Central Plains? Chapter 1966. Su Fengnian shook his head and said, if it was in the past, the Liang imperial court still had control over the territory of the Central Plains. But now that the 3 kings have raised their armies, everything has become a variable. Beimang can certainly stake everything on this gamble. Su Fengnian gently held a piece of white jade the size of an egg in his hand and slowly stroked it. This piece of white jade was slightly red, its texture was delicate, and it looked clumsy and simple. Su Fengnian could not bear to put it down. In fact, the item itself was not that rare. Compared to the fine jade that was carved into fine shapes, its price was as different as heaven and earth. However, the origin of this item was very interesting. Jiang and I, Su Ying, and Jia Jiajia had secretly carried a heavy cloth bag back to North Jiebei City not long ago. Everyone's clothes were stained with dust and mud. They swaggered into this study room as if they were asking for credit. They opened the cloth bag and poured it onto the floor. Most of the items were ordinary pebbles that were playful and pleasing, mixed with some green jade that could barely be sold for a few copper coins. However, the three of them had really picked up a treasure. It was this piece of white jade that Su Fengnian had left on the desk to play with. Su Fengnian was very cunning. He squatted down and pretended to wantonly belittle the stone, saying that this was not worth a single copper coin and that the stone was just a cobblestone that would not even look good on the road. In the end, he sighed and picked up the piece of white jade with a beautiful color. He casually tossed it around and then took out 5 or 6 copper coins from his money bag and threw it to the little mud man covered in dust, saying that this was a friendly price. Although the little mud man was doubtful and felt that he had suffered a loss, he was still a fledgling in the field of business after all. He was shamelessly picked up by the young king. Logically speaking, such a fine piece of white jade should be worth at least 20 taels of silver if it was passed to a scholarly family in Gangnam-do. If it was carved by a famous jade craftsman, it would be even more difficult to say how much it would be worth. When the 3 girls finally left the study room, the new money pouch on Jiang Ni's waist, which had been shriveled since they arrived at North Rejecting City, finally had some vitality. Jia Jiajia carried the heavy cloth pouch that had been filled with stones again and planned to make a small nest in the courtyard to play. Su Ying, on the other hand, was holding the copper coin that Jiang and I gave her. Everyone was happy. Yang Xianxia hesitated for a moment before finally lowering her voice to ask, "Dare I ask why Wang Yi is so determined to win the Battle of Luzhou? So much so that he didn't hesitate to mobilize the troops of the Qingyuan army to leave Liangzhou?" Su Fengnian suddenly tightened his grip on the piece of seed material in the palm of his hand, which was gradually heating up. He stared at this deputy Jidushi of Bailiang Road, who had a new lease of life after withered wood. Suddenly he joked, "Why don't you take a guess?" Yang Xianxia was caught off guard and did not know how to answer. After truly assimilating into Bailiang's officialdom, this veteran general also knew some interesting news about Bailiang that had not spread to the Central Plains and the capital. For example, the old prince of Liang, Su Xiao, liked to say, "Why don't you take a guess?" It was one of his catchphrases. Seeing the old man unable to hide his restraint and helplessness, Su Fengnian smiled and went straight to the point. There are many inside stories involved. For example, the crown prince of Beimeng once sent a message to me. Before Yelu Dongchuang left the Central Plains for the grasslands, he had a private meeting with me. There is also a long-term plan related to Hong Jia's escape to the north. It even involves the commander-in-chief of Beimeng's Western Front, Wang Sui, and that Gu Deziguo who is in charge of the 2 Liao provinces. If I really want to go into detail, I'm afraid I'll have to talk all night. I believe that General Yang is certain of one thing. On the battlefield outside Liangzhou Pass to the north of North Rejecting City, with the military strength of Liang Mang and the Bailiang cavalry, it is impossible for our Bailiang cavalry to obtain a complete victory in a frontal battle. At most, it will be a Pyrrhic victory. Yang Xianxia nodded without hesitation. Su Fengnian gently placed the white jade document on the desk like a chess piece on a chessboard. When my master was alive, he always tirelessly told me that the depth of a national player's skill is always outside the chessboard. When I was young, I thought that my master always lost to my second sister in chess because he was looking for an excuse for his lack of strength. But as time passed, I realized that everything in the world is like chess, where victory and defeat must be determined. This is the truth. Su Fengnian slowly stood up and stretched out his finger to press on the seed material. When Su Xiao was in the most difficult situation in Liang in his early years, because he fought many tough battles that others were unwilling to fight, he didn't have many soldiers and horses under his command. Why were the big shots in Liang still willing to bet on Su Xiao? It's very simple. Su Xiao was always able to win a battle when almost everyone was not optimistic about him. This attracted the attention of the imperial court and made the old foxes who held the military seal in their hands feel that it was worth a bet. The inside stories I mentioned earlier, those national players hiding behind layers of curtains, were actually very fake. Both Bailiang and Bailiang are well aware that they won't act until they see the rabbit. There's no other way. Bailiang can only take an unconventional approach and make those people standing in front of the gambling table feel that it's time to sit down and gamble big. Otherwise, if they're too slow, they'll only be able to get some leftovers to fill the gaps between their teeth. Su Fengnian smiled. None of these guys have small appetites, so I have to let them see my sincerity. For example, Yang Xianxia subconsciously asked. For example? Su Fengnian said softly. For example, when the Iron Cavalry outside Liangzhou Pass defended Beiqing without losing it, the Liuzhou Cavalry won a great victory at Old Woman Mountain. Then they went all the way north and took Beimang's southern capital, Shijing. Yang Xianxia was a grandmaster in both the imperial court and the battlefield, so he understood it immediately. However, this veteran who had experienced the War of Spring and Autumn did not feel relaxed at all. Instead, his heart became heavier. The young lord only said that he was going to defend Beiqing. Then what about the north of Beiqing? Huaiyang Pass, Liuya, Fuling and Grave, 3 major military towns. Chu Lushan, Zhou Kang, Li Yanchao, and Lu Dian, for generals. No one knew when, except for the 2 people who were standing at the table next to each other, the rest of the people had left the study room. After Yang Xianxia also walked out of the study room, the young lord held the seed material and walked to the window. He looked up at the loquat tree. Although it was mid-autumn, the green was still lush. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter, leaves can grow green. Birth, old age, illness, and death, people can't live forever. Chapter 1967. As soon as the autumn equinox passed, the battle situation outside Liangzhou Pass suddenly became tense. Previously, the scouts from both sides of Liangmang were roaming about outside the pass. Their forces were more or less equal. Although Beimang's Ma Lanzi had the advantage in numbers, due to the battle on the Longyan Plains, the 2 elite scouts who were most familiar with the border army's terrain and had the most outstanding fighting power, Dongzhuo's Crow Lanzi and Great General Lu Gui's Black Fox Lanzi, were almost completely wiped out. The Ma Lanzi who followed the army to the south of Huda City could not be said to be a headless fly, but compared to Liangzhou's second-class scouts, who were incomparably familiar with the terrain, they still did not have an advantage. Whenever the 2 sides encountered a sudden battle, Beimang's Ma Lanzi was ordered to take the initiative to attack regardless of casualties. Many times they met on narrow roads. Even though Beimang's Ma Lanzi was at a disadvantage in terms of military strength in some parts of the battlefield, they still charged bravely without fear of death, even if they had to sacrifice 3 for 1. The rich and overbearing Murong Baoding personally promised that as long as the Ma Lanzi advanced to the front line, regardless of whether it was his direct subordinates or other troops, not only would they be able to obtain military merit by beheading the enemy, they would also be able to exchange their own losses for military merit. Under this kind of unreasonable and intense attack by Beimang, Bailiang's scouts never suffered heavy casualties in a single battle. However, after the losses accumulated time and time again, in a short period of 20 days, according to the intelligence reports from the left and right cavalry, more than 700 men had died in battle. The Liangzhou border army had no choice but to start gathering small groups of scouts, at the same time reducing the width and depth of the scouting line, decisively giving up on the risky move of sending a small group of scouts to roam in and out of the enemy's territory. Back then, Bailiang had chosen to place great importance on the Liuzhou battlefield and did not hesitate to shift their forces to the west. For example, Li Hanlin's white horse crossbowmen had all moved into Liuzhou. Not to mention the control Bailiang City had over the border defense line of Huaiyang Pass, Luya, Fuling, and Grave. The connection with the left and right cavalry was growing thinner and thinner. This was definitely not a good sign. As the main force of the Bailiang border army, the left and right cavalry's main purpose was not to kill the enemy, but to link up Bailiang City and Huaiyang Pass defense line, preventing Beimang's cavalry from completely dividing the battlefield outside Liangzhou Pass. However, from the current situation, unless Murong Baoding was willing to hold his troops back, unwilling to lose the Winter Thunder elite cavalry and Ruran cavalry, slowing down the speed of his horse hooves and allowing the Liangzhou scouts to seize the opportunity to regain the initiative, from the perspective of the chessboard, the stalemate between the 2 sides was already set in stone. During this period of time, the northern Liangdao's only official in the northern part of the city, the administrator Li Gongda proposed to have Li Hanlin lead the remaining Liuzhou white horse crossbowmen back to the battlefield outside Liangzhou Pass. However, this proposal was rejected by both the young king and deputy Jidushi Yang Shenxing. The result of the magnificent cavalry battle at Old Woman Mountain in Liuzhou, which was destined to go down in history, had not yet been accurately reported to Jubiai City outside the Liangzhou Pass. The last urgent military document from a scout under Liangzhou's General Shi Fu was still neatly placed on the table in the small study next to the signing room. Even though they knew that the new Prince of Liang, who had accumulated great power and influence, valued the twin jade annulus of Great Chu, no less than the two trusted generals, Yuluan Dao and Chao Wei, who were born in northern Liang, the military document written by Shi Fu himself was still straightforward, revealing the unique cruelty of a battlefield. Thank you to the monk soldiers of the Western Frontier Division for blocking the 50,000 cavalry with 15,000 infantrymen. Forgive me for not being able to rescue them. I will only follow the established plan to block the remaining Southern Dynasty's cavalry from going south. Joining forces with Ningamei's 4,000 iron stupas, we will definitely block the Yellow Song's Pu tribe's main force from retreating north. Whether Bailiang's monk soldiers and Lantua Mountain's monk soldiers live or die, my Qingyuan army can't help. In fact, the true ruthlessness of the battlefield lay in Shi Fu's words. Even if my stone talisman army can rush to the corridor battlefield in time, as long as Bailiang's infantrymen still have the strength to block the Southern Dynasty's main force, then the Qingyuan army's cavalry will stop far away and choose not to rescue them. This was to prevent the Southern Dynasty's main force from giving up on rescuing Old Woman Mountain and decisively fleeing north, returning to the Southern Dynasty's main force. The young king did not summon the generals to discuss this matter in the conference hall. He did not even instruct the stone talisman to send it directly to the study room to browse and circulate. That evening, Su Fengyan sat quietly in the study room for a while and then wrote a letter to Liangzhou's General Shi Fu. The content of the letter was concise and comprehensive. It roughly talked about the follow-up of the corridor battlefield. Shi Fu, since you are a general of a province, you should act according to your discretion. There is no need to report everything to Bailiang City. When the young king finally stamped the King of Bailiang official seal on the large blank space of the letter, the counselor in green took the letter and hurriedly left. The young king sat alone in the study room and was silent for a long time. The night was as cold as water. The mansion in Bailiang City was still brightly lit. The sound of footsteps was like a drum, incessant. They were already used to it. Su Fengyan was in his study, staring at two maps of the situation on the table with Crone Mountain and Huayang Pass as the main focus. He suddenly raised his head and saw Yang Shenxing, Great Ancestor Gu, and Bai Yu walking over together. His expression was extremely solemn. Great Ancestor Gu said with a hoarse voice, "We've just received news that Murong Baoding personally led the Winter Thunder Elite Cavalry and the Ruren Cavalry, each with a force of 20,000. Together with the 30,000 reinforcements from Wang Yong, the abbot of Aquarius State, they attacked Lu Diyuan's left cavalry of 24,000. Zhou Kong and Li Yanchao couldn't rescue them in time." Yang Shenxing said bitterly, "From the looks of it, the 10,000 Ruren cavalry that fought with Li Yanchao of the right cavalry was just a bait. The remaining 20,000 Ruren cavalry had already joined up with Murong Baoding's direct troops and were heading straight for the left cavalry. The so-called splitting of the troops into two directions, with the 30,000 Ruren cavalry attacking the right cavalry of Liang Province, and Murong Baoding staying in the 20,000 infantry camp without moving, was all a pretense. In fact, the 20,000 infantry were pretending to be the Ruren cavalry, and in the end, they joined forces with Wang Yong to attack the left cavalry." Su Fengyan's face turned slightly pale. He muttered softly, 20,000 Winter Thunder Elite Cavalry, 20,000 Ruren Cavalry, and 30,000 Aquarius Elite Cavalry, a total of 70,000 Beimang First-Class Cavalry. Yang Shenxing was about to speak when Bai Yu tugged at the sleeve of this veteran general, signaling him not to speak for the time being. The young vassal king who was sitting upright behind the desk slowly raised his head and asked, "How are the casualties of the Beimang barbarians?" Yang Shenxing tried his best to calm the intense emotions in his heart as he answered, Murong Baoding did not send in all his troops at once. After the Winter Thunder Private Cavalry lost 9,000 men, he still did not retreat from the battlefield. Then he sent in 20,000 Ruren cavalry. Luding, the left cavalry fought until Wang Yong's cavalry entered the battlefield. At that time, the remaining Winter Thunder cavalry had no choice but to watch from the sidelines. There were almost no Ruren cavalry left on the battlefield. The Aquarius cavalry still lost 6,000 men. Only 800 left cavalry managed to break out of the encirclement and return to North Jiebei City. The first deputy commander of the left cavalry, Lu Duan, and the other two deputy commanders all died in battle. In early autumn, there was once a left cavalry soldier who raised his arms to release eagles outside North Jiebei City. The scene was still vivid in his mind. Grand Ancestor Gu suddenly said bluntly, "Since the left cavalry is gone, the right cavalry cannot hold the fort alone. They can no longer control the situation outside Liang Province Pass, which is north of North Jiebei City and south of the Grave. Your Highness, you must not agree to Zhou Kong and Li Yanchao's request for battle." Su Fengnian nodded and said, "Immediately send an order to Zhou Kong and Li Yanchao. The right cavalry must do their best to avoid Beimang's main force heading south." Bai Yu said somewhat helplessly that Jean Partridge's military order has actually reached Jidushi Yang's barracks. From the commander to the 3 deputy commanders and all the captains, they have all signed a bloody handprint. They request to fight to the death and guarantee that they will at least wipe out Murong Baoding's Winter Thunder Cavalry and Wang Yong's main force. Su Fengnian stood up and said sternly, "Then add one more sentence. Tell Zhou Kong and Li Yanchao clearly that it is very easy for them to die. If they dare to disobey the orders of North Jiebei City, I, Su Fengnian, will personally go outside the pass and wring their heads." Yang Shun, who had never seen a young king get angry in front of his face, was shocked. Grand Ancestor Gu sighed softly. Bai Yu was calm and composed. He smiled and said, "With North Jiebei City's reply to the right cavalry, old General Yang and I, the governor of Liang Province, will have an easier time." Chapter 1968. The 3 big shots of North Jiu quickly left with their own thoughts. Chancellor Wang, who was on duty in the ceremonial room, walked into the study with 2 pots of green ant wine. He saw that the young king had not yet sat down. He was standing behind the desk, looking down at the 2 big seals on the table. One was naturally the world-famous Liang Wang seal, which was regarded as the most important small object in the world during Liang Yonghui's reign. In the past 20 years, as long as it involved more than 5,000 people in the northwest border, this seal had to be stamped. The shape of this seal was exactly the same as the current Zhao imperial court, imitating the style of Dechu of the Central Plains during the spring and autumn period. It was a jade seal, and the strokes of the seal were even, without any sharp edges. It had always been regarded as authentic calligraphy. But next to this Liang Wang seal, there was another seal that had long been withdrawn from Bailiang's officialdom. After the Su family's armored cavalry followed Bailiang's butcher Su Shao into Bailiang, this ancient bronze seal was habitually called the Great General Seal. Occasionally, it would be seen in some important military inscriptions outside the pass. After heir Su Fengnian officially became the king of Bailiang, it completely disappeared from the border army's field of vision. The Great General Seal was written in willow leaf script. The bronze seal was 3 cun 3 fen, 9 fen thick, and shaped like a crouching tiger and coiling dragon. Now, the Liang army's permanent general with real power, Wu Zhengjinping, had long switched to using the silver seal of the Qiding script, abandoning the knife-like willow leaf script. In fact, Mount Qingliang also had a big seal, mainly used for the promotion and dispatch of Bailiang's officials. Su Fengnian made an exception and left it to Deputy Administrator Song Dongming, allowing him to stamp the seal himself after the official document was approved, to show his superior position of sole power. After Chancellor Wang sat down, he opened 2 pots of wine and leaned forward to hand one to the young king. It was better to enjoy together than to enjoy alone. The old Confucian raised his head and drank a mouthful of strong wine, exclaiming in joy. Then he looked at Su Fengnian and said, "I have heard about the left cavalry. Some words have accumulated in my stomach for almost 20 years and I have to spit them out. You don't have to say anything, just drink and listen to me. Su Fengnian sat back in his chair and nodded. This renowned scholar of the literary world, the leader of the scholarly circles, slowly said, I have always had 7 orifices and 6 orifices on the battlefield, but I know nothing about it. As a result, apart from bringing a few scholars to Bailiang, which can be considered a small contribution, I don't have any other achievements to show for it. I can only peacefully stay in the remote academies and study. In all these years, I've secretly traveled to Bailiang many times and met Su Xiao a few times. I've also met Li Yishan from Tide Listening Pavilion a few times. Su Xiao is known for being a terrible chess player. His chess skills are among the worst in the world, but his ability to reverse his moves is top-notch. That's why I don't like to interact with him. Noticing the strange look on the young lord's face, the old master continued to say shamelessly, Li Yishan is a rare and extraordinary person. Of course, he would be arrogant and treat me as his confidant. Su Fengnian finally couldn't help but say, that's enough. This old man choked on his wine and coughed a few times. The wine from the pot of green ants spilled all over his clothes. The old man casually patted his robe and said, Li Yishan, who is in seclusion on the top floor of Tide Listening Pavilion, stands too high and sees too far. That's why he inevitably feels lonely. Sages have been like this since ancient times, so it's impossible to escape. Every time I go there to visit, even though Li Yishan doesn't give me a good face, I know that this guy must be happy. There were a few times when he was drunk, and Li Yishan would say some heartfelt words to me. He never talked about the Liang imperial court, but talked less about the strategist Su Xiao and more about the Northwest. At this point, this old man, who seemed to be taking advantage of his seniority, paused and drank a large mouthful of green ant wine. He first stuffed it in his mouth, and then suddenly raised his neck and poured it into his stomach. His old body couldn't help but tremble. His weathered cheeks turned red. He continued, as for the strategizing of the literati and the military strategy of the scholars, I don't accept Bin Shi of Liang, nor Nailan Yusi of Nanjiang, or even Huang Longsher. As for Zhao Chongling, who suppressed Li Yishan even after death, don't even mention him. As to why Zhao Chongling was more famous than Li Yishan both in life and in death, Li Yishan himself and Su Xiao, who knew better, both had their own difficulties. Li Yishan was born a poor scholar. Zhao Chongling, the grandson of the Dechu aristocracy, was more or less the Song family jade tree of the present Song Maolin in West Chu. When Zhao Chongling chose to assist the fallen Su Xiao, what was it? 800 servants in a grandiose manner. Can you imagine that? In any case, this old man is not willing to think about it. The more I think, the more envious I am. Su Xiao wants to win over the landowning households in the north and south of the river. Zhao Chongling is an eye-catching flag. Otherwise, would Su Xiao say something like, the entire army can die in battle, but Mr. Zhao must live? The old man smiled. Of course, Zhao Chongling is also very capable. Zhao Chongling contributed greatly to Su Xiao's destruction of the 6 countries in the later stages of the Spring and Autumn War. His reputation was so good that even the old emperor of Liang, Zhao Li, wanted to invite him into the court to be made a marquis. And Li Shan? The old emperor Zhao Li never mentioned him. In reality, every time Su Xiao reported his military achievements, he praised Zhao Chongling greatly. His memorials were full of flowers, but as long as it was related to Li Yishan's schemes, he did not mention anything. Wang Ye, do you know why? Su Fengnian said calmly, I only know that those beautifully worded articles were incited by Su Xiao, and then written by my master himself. The old man nodded. So, the old emperor and Su Xiao are of one mind. Mr. Zhao, the Liang imperial court can use a hoe to poach people away. That Su Xiao admits defeat. But don't think about the unknown Li Yishan in court. Otherwise, you will be crossing the line. Su Xiao may really start a rebellion. Su Fengnian smiled and said, starting a rebellion is an exaggeration. My master was the first to oppose it. The old man snorted and glared. Give an example, do you not understand? Su Fengnian finally picked up the fragrant green ant wine and took a sip. Old mister, please continue to give pointers. The old man suddenly asked, "What did I want to say at the beginning?" Su Fengnian put down the wine jug. "You two often talk about the Northwest." The old man suddenly understood. Yes. Li Shan once told me a secret after he was drunk. He said that if Bai Liang wanted to defeat Bai Mang in the worst-case scenario, they had to create a situation first. The old man stopped halfway through his deliberately mystifying speech. He narrowed his eyes and smiled. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked at the many objects on the desk. When the old man's gaze stopped on the seal of Prince Fengliang, Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Even if I was willing to give it to you, would you dare to accept it?" The old man's gaze shifted slightly to the bronze seal of the general, which now only had symbolic meaning. Su Fengnian glared at him angrily and said rudely, "Don't even think about it." The old man who originally wanted to take advantage of the situation was reluctant to part with it. He muttered regretfully, "That kind of willow leaf script that contains the style of the frontier fortress of Dafeng is not commonly seen." Then the old man raised his chin and saw the white jade seed material beside the young king's jug of green ant wine. His eyes lit up. This poor new Prince Fengliang actually left behind something that was worth a little bit of silver? Su Fengnian put away the seed material and sneered, "If Mr. Wang has the ability to snatch it away, then don't dream about it." The old man curled his lips. With Chancellor Wang's martial arts aptitude, even if he gave the old man 1,000 years of martial arts cultivation, it would still be useless to snatch something from a martial arts grandmaster. No young man would bully an old man like him. Su Fengnian gently held the white jade seed material and said straightforwardly, "Actually, I can guess what Master said. The only chance for us Bailiang cavalry to win against Bai Mang is to first exhaust Bai Mang's top-class border army and grassland elite private army. Then even if Bai Mang exhausted its national strength, it would still be able to support the third great battle of Liang Mang. However, at that time, Bai Mang's hundreds of thousands of cavalry, compared to Lu Jinu who was guarding Hudu town, and compared to me who is guarding Jubiai town, the Bai Mang cavalry that we are facing is actually just an embroidered pillow that looks good but is useless. From Dongzhuo's private cavalry in the first great battle of Liang Mang, to Yang Yuanzhan's direct cavalry in the mouth of the calabash, to Lu Gui's trusted cavalry, to the Chang cavalry in the second great battle, to the Ruan cavalry of Hong Jingyan and Murong Baoding's Winter Thunder elite cavalry, to the 20,000 cavalry of the Huangsong Puzhong army in Liuzhou, the cavalry of the Wanyan family in Longguan, and so on. They are all on this list. Su Fengnian said calmly, "For example, as long as we take down the Battle of Old Woman Mountain in Liuzhou, not only will we lose all of Gusai Prefecture's border army elites, we will also lose half of the Southern Dynasty. This is the potential advantage that the first great battle of Liang Mang brought to Bailiang." The old man asked doubtfully, "You mean to say that Bai Mang's peace order plan has a fatal flaw?" Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "You are only half right." The old man was confused and almost wanted to scratch his ears and cheeks. Su Fengnian thought for a moment, then picked up the wine pot and tilted it slowly, as if he wanted to place it horizontally in front of his eyes. Up until now, Bai Mang still has a greater chance of victory, but Bailiang has sacrificed so many people just to tilt this wine pot. When the time comes, the more powerful Bai Mang is, the more intense the collapse will be. The wine pot tilted more and more, and just as the wine was about to spill out of the pot, Su Fengnian gently put it back on the table. Su Fengnian suddenly said without reason, "Now I'm afraid that the old madam and the magistrate of Taiping are willing to throw away the broken jar. Not only the West capital, but also half of the Southern Dynasty. They are determined to break into North resisting city." The old man's face was pale. He asked tentatively, "Bai Mang won't be so crazy and decisive, right?" Su Fengnian looked at the night sky outside the window and said, "God knows." The old man only thought that the young king said it casually, but he didn't know that the words, "God knows," were exactly the literal meaning. Tuoba inexplicably obtained the body of a celestial being, and his martial arts cultivation was close to Wang Xianji's peak. At the critical moment, he even surpassed him. Since even Tuoba was so lucky, then wouldn't the old woman of Bai Mang, who occupied half of the world's fate, be even more blessed? Thunder and rain were all the grace of the monarch. It was also the will of God. Chancellor Wang took the empty wine pot and left. The young king stared at the map of the situation outside Liangzhou Pass that was spread on the table. At the same time, in a heavily guarded tent in Beiming, the candlelight that was as thick as a baby's arm swayed gently. The peace order stood in front of the table and looked down at a map of the situation of the 4 provinces of Beiliang. He chuckled and said, "The chess players of the Central Plains all say that the golden horn, the silver border, and the grass belly, is it true?" Chapter 1969. The garrison troops outside the North Barbarian city began to evacuate the miscellaneous people in the market town. The scholars who carried books and traveled to study, recited poems and composed essays, and the heroes who rode their horses in the west wind with fairies, gradually returned to the south with the geese in the sky above their heads. At dawn, a group of more than 40 people was particularly eye-catching. They were all scholars from Xianxia Academy. They had elegant temperaments and were the best scholars in the world. After the caravan crossed the river south, a carriage stopped at the riverbank. 2 women, one big and one small, walked down. The girl had 2 braids and was holding a big fat white cat in her arms. The woman had a graceful figure and a stunning appearance. She was like a plump peony that stole the color of the country. She was in full bloom. She looked to the north. At the end of her vision was the southern city wall of the North Barbarian city. She could vaguely see the clanking of iron armor, but there was no king's robe. The little girl with braids, who was once praised by someone in Xianxia Academy as unparalleled fist technique and invincible leg technique, pouted and spoke up for her sister. "Sister, you're a heartless and heartless man. What's there to miss?" "Humph. I must have been blind to think that he was a dog. In fact, he's not even as good as Qi Shent's, that idiot." The woman with the enchanting but cold aura was indifferent. The little girl pulled the big white cat's neck and raised her head to ask carefully, "Why don't we go to the gate of that mansion and scold him?" "Don't worry, as long as I do it myself, I'll definitely scold that guy." "What bullsh***t Grandmaster of Martial Arts? What number 1 person in the world? None of them are my opponents." The older woman was Yu Wei, the teacher from Xianxia Academy. She rubbed the little girl's head and smiled gently. "There are some things that you'd rather not fight for. You'll only cause trouble if you're restless." The little girl put her hands on her hips and threw the white cat to the ground. She raised her head and said, "Sister, how could there be such a magnanimous woman in this world? We are women. Alas, why didn't you personally go and ask? Why did you become a deserter at the last minute? What's going on? Didn't the history books always say that treacherous villains love to deceive the heaven? Perhaps that guy surnamed Su didn't even know that you had come to North Resisting City, and then you returned to the Central Plains in a fit of pique without saying a word. Didn't you end up being taken advantage of by those vixens who took over your nest? No, absolutely not. I must uphold justice for you." Just as the angry little girl took a step forward, Yu Wei grabbed one of her braids and gently pulled it back to its original position. The little girl frowned and said pitifully, "You're really not going?" Yu Wei smiled and said, "There's no need to go. I know he knows that I've been here." The little girl was still angry. "I don't care what you know or he knows. I just can't stand it. The saying that it's better to forget each other in Jianghu than to help each other in times of need. It's all a lie. How can it compare to the love between a scholar and a beauty?" The little girl looked at Sister Yu, who was calm. The little girl, who didn't know what love was, began to cry. She gently kicked away the big fat white cat by her feet and raised her slender arm to wipe her tender face. She sobbed and said, "No wonder my mother disliked the movie The First Snow the most. She always said that many of the words in the movie were too prophetic. It made all the women in the world unable to have the slightest bit of yearning. Especially the sentence, 'Too much affection will always be ruined by ruthlessness,' which is the most hateful." Her ancestors and parents were indeed learned scholars in Xianxia Academy. The little girl's speech was not very elegant, but it was definitely not comparable to the common children in the Central Plains. Suddenly, a cold voice sounded above the little girl's head. "The first snow is full of nonsense. The sentence, 'May all the good people in the world become a beautiful couple,' is the most hateful. Only the sentence, Too much affection will always be ruined by ruthlessness that you said is worthy of being called a piece of advice. 2 goat horn braids tilted backward. The little girl's eyes were hazy with tears. She blinked her watery eyes and looked up at the uninvited guest who seemed to have descended from the sky. The woman was tall and slender, just like the Mount Amay that was described in the travel notes of the literati. She was beautiful beyond compare. In the little girl's eyes, the fairy sister was dressed in purple and extremely beautiful. She had a sharp chin, which was like an icicle hanging under the eaves during a heavy snowfall. The little girl didn't know why she fell in love with this sister in purple at first sight. However, she was very afraid of her and felt very conflicted. Yu Wei asked politely, neither friendly nor distant, "May I know why the leader of the Xianyuan Alliance has suddenly come to visit?" Hearing the name leader of the Xianyuan Alliance, the eyes of the girl with the goat horn braids lit up. She really didn't lose to the civil and military officials. After hearing the name Emperor, she mustered up her courage and took a step forward. She sneakily stretched out 2 fingers and secretly pinched the corner of the fairy sister's clothes. Then she turned around and said with a face full of joy, Sister Yu, the purple clothes on her must be like the rumors in Jianghu. They are made from the silk spat out by the ice silkworms on the peak of Mount Kunlun, the ancestor of the dragon bloodline. They are smooth and soft and very comfortable to touch. It is said that they are invulnerable to weapons and water and fire. This dress alone is priceless. Our leader of the Xianyuan Alliance spent half of the Great Snow Plateau's financial resources to invite a reclusive Mahis scholar to make 4 pieces. She wears 1 each in the spring, summer, autumn, and winter. When she goes out, she flies here and there. When she passes famous mountains and rivers, her feet never touch the ground. She flies past with a whoosh. In the distance, the young scholars who had heard of Xianyuan Zi's name for a long time but had never seen her in person were fascinated by her extraordinary elegance. They secretly compared the leader of the Wulin Alliance with Master Yu. On the other hand, they sincerely admired the courage of the boy with the goat horn braids. Everyone knew that the leader of the Xianyuan family had an extremely strange temper. He was even more temperamental than those incapable rulers who were cursed in the history books. They were all worried that the little girl would be smashed into pieces by Xianyuan Qingfeng's slap. These scholars had traveled all the way west to the border of Bailiang and had interacted with the little girl day and night. In addition, they had spoiled the little girl in the academy. Even though they were extremely afraid of Mount Huishan Zi's fierce reputation, there were still 7 or 8 people who walked forward together. However, Xianyuan Qingfeng only glanced at them from the corner of his eyes, and those scholars who were full of righteousness involuntarily retreated. In an instant, they were all drenched in sweat. No wonder there was a famous Jianghu big shot who joked that there were countless beautiful pomegranate dresses in the world, but Mount Huishan Zi's dress was the most difficult to kneel to. If one wanted to kneel or dared to kneel, they had to have the ability to do so. The little girl who didn't know the immensity of heaven and earth suddenly added fuel to the fire and patted the purple dress. Then she jogged in front of everyone and laughed loudly. She said proudly, "You all saw it. I've already exchanged blows with Mount Huishan Zi. How about it? When I said that I've exchanged blows with Su Fengnian in the academy, you all didn't believe me. Now, you should believe me, right?" Everyone was dumbstruck. Some of the timid young scholars had already begun to wipe off their cold sweat, afraid that they would witness a bloody and cruel scene in the next moment. Yu Wei said softly, "She's just a child. Her words carry no harm. I hope that the leader of the Xianyuan Alliance will forgive her." Xianyuan Qingfeng glanced at the little girl who had her back to him. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, but he quickly restrained himself. He turned to Yu Wei and said softly, "Don't worry. I won't lower myself to the same level as a child." Yu Wei felt relieved. Her stiff body gradually softened. Obviously, her heart was not as calm as her face. Xianyuan Qingfeng, who was only 1 paper away from becoming an immortal on Earth, naturally saw this clearly. However, he was too lazy to care about it, and even more disdained to care about it. Ever since this woman made her debut, she had never lacked news about Jianghu, and every time she did, it would shock the world. Most recently, It was related to the Taibai sword sect, which had recently risen to become one of the top 10 sects in Liang. That banished immortal Chen Tianyuan arrived at the foot of Mount Wudong, but did not participate in the Wudong Martial Arts Symposium. On his journey to the Central Plains, he unfortunately encountered Zi, who had long been famous in the world. It was rumored that the momentum of that unexpected encounter could be said to be earth-shattering. It caused half of Hezhou to tremble and the mountains to shake. It was said that Chen Tianyuan took 17 breaths and consecutively struck with his sword 3,000 times. In the night, the sword light illuminated half of Hezhou as if it was daytime. After this battle, the banished immortal Chen Tianyuan's reputation did not fall. Instead, it skyrocketed. Xianyuan Qingfeng was even catching up with the new Prince Liang. Those who flattered Mount Huishan believed that the title of number one in the world would only be known after the battle. Those who were neutral also felt that it was the worst. This female alliance chief was able to enter the ranks of martial arts grandmasters and become the high and mighty fifth person, behind Beimang's Huyen Temple. Xianyuan Qingfeng put his hands behind his back. Together with Yu Yue, he looked to the north toward the majestic border city that had yet to be completed. The northwest sky was high and the wind was strong. The two women's sleeves fluttered in the wind. Xianyuan Qingfeng looked to the front and suddenly sneered. That Su fellow is willing to let such a magnificent scene slip by? Yu Yue only felt that it was shrouded in fog. She did not know what Mount Huishan Zi was planning. Xianyuan Qingfeng finally said, "Whether you fight or not, it depends on your mood. You have to be clear with your words. Don't beat around the bush. You only feel that the other party has failed to live up to your deep feelings and good intentions. In fact, you only have yourself to blame." Yu Yue dismissed it with a smile. When Xianyuan Qingfeng's figure flashed and disappeared, this Mr. Ji Shang of Shangyin Academy muttered to himself, "You are not me, and I am not you." A purple rainbow fell into North Jiebei City. The little girl with ponytails, who had picked up the big white cat again, looked to the sky. Her eyes were dazzled. She clicked her tongue in wonder and said, "So domineering, so powerful. When I grow up, I want to be like this too." When Yu Yue got on the car and leaned over, she finally realized what Xianyuan Qingfeng meant by the magnificent scene. She smiled helplessly. Chapter 1970. She remembered that in the past there was a prodigal son who joked that if he lowered his head to look, he would not be able to see the tip of his feet. Now that Yu Yue remembered it, she did not think it was ridiculous or funny. Instead, she felt a little bitter. These words, even if she stopped him in the past, he would have said it. Now that she asked him to say it, she was afraid he was not in the mood to say it. It was unknown when it started, but in the mansion of the vassal king, many high-ranking officials, especially the military counselor, would jog around the outside of the walls of the vassal king's mansion 3 times every morning, and then they would practice boxing together on the open space in front of the conference hall and the 6th department's wing room. It was said that the boxing style was created by the previous Wudong cult leader Hong Shixiang. After the young vassal king's deletion and integration, it was simplified from the orthodox 108 styles of the big frame of Wudong Mountain to the small frame of 36 styles practiced by the people of the vassal king's mansion. The essence was still there, and it reduced a lot of the cumbersome postures that were not easy for the ordinary people at the foot of the mountain to perform. The movements alternated between fast and slow, like moving clouds and flowing water, which was most suitable for stretching the muscles and bones, consolidating the foundation, and nourishing the qi. Over time, led by Chancellor Wang of the ceremonial chamber and Song Changsui of the workshop, they took the initiative to participate in the morning running and practicing boxing together with the officials of the vassal king's mansion. Bai Yu of the household chamber, because of his weak eyesight, would also stand under the eaves of the wing room every day, smiling and squinting his eyes at each other. Because the official Li, the administrator, personally led the official Li, was a group of dragons without a leader, Li Gongda developed the habit of going to the top of the city wall every day before dawn. Li Gongda, as the role model of the older generation of civil officials in Beiliang, although he could sit on the sand pile and chat with the bumpkin craftsmen who built the city, he was unwilling to mingle with a bunch of younger generation in the officialdom. Therefore, naturally he would not mix with them. The officials of the official Li also gave up, and the officials on duty of the military and penal departments did not need to exercise their bodies, so they also did not join in the fun. But even so, the morning of the vassal king's mansion already gave people a kind of lively atmosphere. Today, the young vassal king accompanied Mr. White Lotus to stand at the top of the stairs, watching more than 200 people practicing boxing together. Among them was the pair of Lu Chengsong and Lu Qingqing. Lu Qingqing did not follow the head of the family Lu Dongjiang back to Guanyi Lingzhou, but instead stayed in North Jiyu to become a temporary rank to rank. The leader of the martial artist mansion was Wudong Jinren Yu Xingrui, who had just entered to the city to be to the Guanyi Lingzhou, to be. The three grandmasters leisurely practicing boxing together in the open space of the vassal king's mansion. Perhaps it was not an exaggeration to say that it was an unprecedented grand occasion. Bai Yu, who stood side by side with the young vassal king, looked straight ahead and said with a smile, "Your Highness, in addition to the three in front of you, according to the intelligence of the torture chamber, the three grandmasters of Nanjiang, Mao Shulang, Cheng Baishuang and Ji Lu, and are also on their way to North Jiyu. It seems that the number one master of Nanzhao, Wei Miao, did not follow his wife back to her hometown after leaving the mountain. Most likely, they are also coming to North Jiyu. Although the blind Shishuguqin master, Xue Songguan, is missing, but Han Laoshan also sent a secret message to Laziku at the border of Lingzhou. This woman also did not follow the former crown prince of Western Shu, Su Su, to the south. As for the likes of Jin Qiudao Manor Master Tong Shangquan and the Snow House Spear Saintly Chongho, there are also more than a handful of people coming here to join in the fun. Your Highness, are you planning to hold a new martial arts assembly for the head of the Huishan family in Great Snow Plateau? Su Fengyan shook his head and said, "After joining in the fun, everyone will go back home. What else can I do? Can I persuade these martial arts grandmasters to go to the battlefield to kill the barbarians? Didn't your junior brother, Qi Xianxia, say that he will go to the Earth Lung Mountain immediately? Moreover, killing enemies on the battlefield has nothing to do with Jianghu." Mr. White Lotus shamelessly retorted, "If I remember correctly, during the 10-year siege of Xiangfan City, countless Jianghu warriors helped Wang Mingyang to resist your Su family's troops." Su Fengyan helplessly said, Yes, Mr. White Lotus is right." Bai Yu jokingly said, I'm not the transport commissioner who dares to punch your highness. So your highness doesn't need to be so careful to please your highness." Su Fengyan laughed with a fake smile. It was obvious that he had learned most of the essence from Jia. "Bai Yu, you're lucky that you're not a Jianghu person. Otherwise, I'd have to exchange pointers with you." Bai Yu suddenly changed the topic and asked softly, "Can I ask about the movements of Groom Yu and Lu Huang, Wang Xianji's two disciples?" Su Fengyan didn't hide anything and said, "Lu Huang is by Li Hanlin's side. As for Groom Yu, you guess." Bai Yu's heart beat faster. "Then it's the same as Su Yambing, who is hiding in Huayang Pass." "I understand. Your Highness, there's something I don't know if I should say." Su Fengyan didn't leave any leeway and said, "I advise you not to say it." Bai Yu turned his head and pretended to be surprised. "What? Is there someone who dares to publicly beat up a provincial governor in front of everyone? Moreover, he's the provincial governor of Liangzhou, the only provincial governor in the 30 provinces north and south of Liang." Su Fengyan still chuckled. "It's a pity that Mr. White Lotus doesn't practice the sword." Bai Yu smiled knowingly and didn't continue to ask. He originally wanted to ask if Xie Shibian, even though he had Groom Yu by his side, had still died in battle in that corridor, then Su Fengyan, the king of Bailiang, wouldn't have a grudge against the general of Liuzhou, Ko Jianghuai. After all, Bai Yu, Yang Xinxing, and Ko Jianghuai were all people on the same mountain. Just like how the deputy administrator Song Dongming had a close relationship with Wang Lin, nicknamed Bailiang's god of fortune. It was also like how Chen Shiliang and Yang Guangdou had a close relationship with the Liuzhou army, while Su Beiji was friendly with Han Laoshan of Lingzhou and Huang Fuji of Yuzhou. The process was different, but the result was the same. Gentlemen made friends, not parties. Scholars gathered together to form a forest. That was just an elegant way of saying that scholars paid more attention to. How about Zhang Julu as an official? He was almost flawless and close to a saint. However, beside him was Tantanon and Huan Wen. Behind him was Zhao Yuling, Wang Xiongui, Yin Maochun, Yuan Gua, and Han Lin, who were important officials from Yonghui Spring. 30 years of cultivation on the mountain. In the end, it was just cultivating the heart. After Baiyu left the mountain to become an official, he saw things more clearly than many of the old foxes who had been in the officialdom for decades. That set of Wudong fist techniques, even if an outsider used it, would still be pleasing to the eye. Baiyu sighed. If one could change to a Taoist breathing technique, whether it was the entry chant of the Taoist temple of Longhu Mountain, the Song of Returning to the Truth, or the Heart Sutra of Wudong Mountain's Jade Pillar Peak, it would allow one's body and spirit to merge, both on the outside and inside. Not to mention how to prolong one's life, it can always cure diseases and strengthen the body. Su Fengnian nodded. If you and I have a chance in the future, you should take the lead to promote your position as the provincial governor of Liangzhou. I will help you say hello to Wudong Mountain. Baiyu suddenly felt a gust of wind blow from the side. Before seeing the face, he heard the voice. The voice was cold, like the winter snow. Wudong Mountain's Jade Pillar Heart Sutra is hard to say. Can Longhu Mountain's Song of Returning to the Truth be taken out? Even Mount Huishan's last guest elder disdains it. Baiyu looked hard and saw a slightly blurry face. However, the dazzling bright purple color confirmed it. Baiyu immediately smiled bitterly and kept quiet out of fear. Mr. White Lotus was rarely afraid of anyone. For example, he was not afraid of Su Fengnian at all. This young vassal king seemed to be incomparably arrogant, but in fact he was the most reasonable when facing people who were willing to be reasonable. However, Baiyu also knew that there were many strange things in this world. There were indeed a small group of people who completely did not like to be reasonable. Coincidentally, the woman beside Baiyu belonged to this small group of people. She was the most unreasonable one. Every time they exchanged letters, Zhao Ningxian, the current leader of the Dragon Tiger Mountain, who lived in seclusion in the Earth Lung Mountain, the first blessed enclave of Taoism, would complain in the letter about how arrogant and rude the young woman surnamed Xianyuan of Mount Hui was. To be able to make Zhao Ningxian, a Taoist priest who was easy to talk to, comment like this, Mount Huishanzi could be considered as a heavenly unreasonable person. After Mount Huishan's reputation soared, first of all, Mount Longhu's pilgrims were not allowed to go up the mountain to burn incense on the 1st and 15th day of the lunar month. Second of all Taoists surnamed Zhao of Mount Longhu were not allowed to come within 10 miles of Mount Huishan. Third of all, no Taoist priest of Mount Huishan was allowed to enter her site. In addition to these 3 prohibitions, she also let people swagger away dozens of ancient trees that were at least 300 years old from Mount Longhu. Among them, there were 4 osmanthus trees and 3 ancient cypresses. After that, she did not forget to let people leave a bag of broken silver, which was less than 10 taels of silver at most. If she was in a bad mood or bored to death, she would even throw a few large objects at Mount Longhu for no apparent reason. Although she didn't hurt anyone, every now and then, a huge object would fly over her head, smashing a huge hole in the ground. As a cultivator, who would be able to endure the peace and quiet on the mountain? However, Baiyu was even more well aware that the most painful part of Zhao Ningxian's complaint was the sloppiness in the depths of the heart of the young leader of Longhu Mountain. Yearning had long been raised, but there was no place to settle. A cultivator had a sword of wisdom in his hand, and the threads of love were easy to cut. Unfortunately, some people were unwilling to cut. Mount Huishan's Taoist master mansion was too close to Mount Huishan's great snow plateau. Only Mount Huishan was neither far nor near. He was just right. Why did Zhao Ningxian, who was known for his good fortune and was known to be ancient since childhood, have to be so difficult to the new Prince Liang? Was it only because of the previous generation's grievances? Was it only because Su Shao led the army to trample Mount Longhu? Of course not. At this time, when Baiyu thought of the young leader of Mount Huishan's sorrow and helplessness, he could not help but feel a little sad. After hesitating for a moment, he looked at the woman and finally could not help but directly say, "Leader Xianyuan, do you know Zhao Ningxian?" Chapter 1971. Xianyuan Qingfeng's expression was indifferent as he interrupted Mr. White Lotus and sneered. You want to say that he likes me? I've known for a long time. I'll have to trouble Mr. White Lotus to pass a message to this guy hiding in Earth Lung Mountain. Tell him to come talk to me face to face if he has the ability. Then I'll let him know how the word regret is written. The young vassal king who had a grudge with the chief of Mount Longhu didn't hide his unperturbed expression at all. If there was a desk in front of him, he would probably slap the desk and shout, "Amazing." Bai Yu face-bombed and remained silent. After today's incident, Mr. White Lotus wouldn't dare to be frank with Zhao Ningxin in the letter even if he was beaten to death. Xianyuan Qingfeng frowned and asked, You're just a little provincial governor. Is it really appropriate for you to stand side by side with a vassal king? Perhaps everything had its vanquishing factor. Bai Yu took a deep breath and turned to leave. He sighed deeply, probably lamenting that public morals were deteriorating day by day and that women were as fierce as tigers. Su Fengnian turned around and looked at the young girl who was sitting on the edge of the roof with her legs crossed. He winked at her and signaled with his eyes. Hee, the girl only chuckled. Compared to Su Fengnian's gloating over Zhao Ningxin's misfortune, she was clearly gloating even more. Su Fengnian knew that the narrow-minded little clay figurine had 3 thresholds that could not be said to be too high, not too high, not too low, and not too high either. In this lifetime, she would never be able to cross the threshold. One of the thresholds had something to do with the princess making things difficult for the princess. But previously, when Su Fengnian worked hard to help the princess earn so many copper coins on Mount Wudong, he had already slightly let go of this matter. The second threshold was related to a certain illusion of leaning against the wall. Chancellor Wang, who had leaked the heavenly secret, had already suffered. During that period of time when the young vassal king had nothing to do, he would play chess with the old man who couldn't control his mouth. He would beat the old man until he threw away his helmet and armor. He beat the old man so much that he almost vomited blood when he saw the chess set and box. The third threshold was related to moving books and sending books. All these years, the little clay figurine had always felt that the most difficult thing in the world was moving books like moving a mountain. However, a certain someone actually sent large boxes of secret manuals to the great snow plains of Mount Hui. Just now, Su Fengnian had already accepted his fate when Su Fengnian barged into the north resisting city. Presumably, Jiang and I had already been alerted. It was already fortunate that he did not see the flying sword kill anyone. Su Fengnian's attempt to bribe Jia was nothing more than a last-ditch struggle. Xianyuan Qingfeng turned a blind eye to this and stood proudly at the top of the stone steps. Of course, she knew that there was a West Chu girl named Jiang and I in this manner. She asked softly, How do you think one is doing now? Su Fengnian was stunned for a moment and was silent for a moment. I think about it occasionally, but I don't dare to think too much about it. She added, If there's a chance in the future, the 3 of us can get together? Back then, I didn't beat him up hard enough. It's a pity. Su Fengnian grinned. All right, but I'll say this first. When the time comes, I'll definitely stop you. She narrowed her eyes slightly and raised her chin slightly. She laughed softly. It doesn't matter if we win or lose. Regardless, that stingy one has to treat us to a drink and rip him off. Su Fengnian nodded. I definitely won't stop you. Xianyuan Qingfeng looked around. I'll just find a place to stay. When I want to return to the Central Plains, you don't have to send me off. I reckon you won't be able to take care of me then. When I get back, I'll help you find that one guy first. No matter how big the Jianghu is, it's still mine. Su Fengnian said softly, Thanks. Xianyuan Qingfeng dismissed it with a smile and disappeared. She came and went without a trace, like a swan goose stepping on snow. Her figure appeared below the northern wall of North Resisting City, and she walked slowly. May all the lovers in the world be together. She had said this to another girl before, and it was the most hateful sentence. However, she had never said it, and it was also the most hopeful sentence. Su Fengnian stood silently where he was. When he came back to his senses, he realized that everyone in the square was looking at him with different expressions. Even the sword grandmaster Chai Qingshan was whispering to the Wudong Jinren Yu Xingrui, and his eyes were especially obscure and playful. Su Fengnian could do nothing about it, and he didn't want to explain further. It was tantamount to giving away 300 taels of silver here. When Su Fengnian arrived at the front yard of the second hall, he saw Deputy Provincial Governor Yang Xianxia standing beside a one-armed old man with white eyebrows, white hair, and white clothes. Su Fengnian glanced at the old man who looked more sage-like than a Daoist immortal hanging on a statue. He was also very distressed. Sui Shigu, last time at Mount Qingliang, I've already let you eat 3 famous swords in one go, including the Thunder of Thousand Gullies. Even if this north-resisting city is turned upside down, there won't be any swords to your liking. Take it that I'm begging you, don't make trouble. The ancestor of Eating Sword, whose long white eyebrows almost reached his knees, twitched the corner of his mouth and sneered. How could you not know that this old man has been coveting the 2 swords of Fuji and Shudao in Tide Listening Pavilion for a long time? This old man is heading north this time because he wants to make a deal with you. This old man will help you kill 2,000 Beimang barbarians outside the pass, at least 2,000 of them. In return, you will give the 2 swords of Fuji and Shudao to this old man. What do you think? Su Fengnian flatly refused. I've said it before. My second sister has been in love with those 2 swords since she was young. She couldn't even bear to take them out of Tide Listening Pavilion. That's why she brought the Red Stallion to Shangyin Academy to study. Even if I'm willing to exchange the 2 swords, do you think I dare? Sui Shigu mocked. Indeed. Even if I lend Su Fengnian 100 times more courage, he wouldn't dare. Su Fengnian walked closer and said in a low voice, although the 2 swords of Fuji and Shudao are among the top 10 swords in the world, there are still 8 other swords in the Central Plains. I'll get you swords that are not inferior to these 2 swords. What do you think? Sui Shigu sneered. It's hard to say if you'll live past the end of this autumn. Where do you get the confidence to help this old man get swords from the Central Plains to Beiliang? Su Fengnian naturally put his arm around Sui Shigu's shoulder and said, that's easy. If you can't get 2 swords of the same level as Shudao, I'll use 20 swords that are slightly inferior to them in exchange. Tide Listening Pavilion still has 7 or 8 swords left. If you ask the Fish Dragon Gang in Beiliang to work hard, I'll be able to get 20 swords. What do you think? As long as it involved business, the young king didn't put on airs and didn't care about his face. Sui Shigu shook his shoulder and shook off the young king's arm. Then he stretched out 2 fingers and twisted his snow-white eyebrows. He narrowed his eyes and pondered, weighing the pros and cons Su Fengnian struck while the iron was hot. He said, Senior Xianxia, you see, there are so many grandmasters from the Central Plains in North Resisting City. Later on, there will be more grandmasters coming here. It shouldn't be hard for me to find a chance to ask them for some good swords. In short, I'll make sure you have a few dishes to go with your wine. What kind of friendship do we have? We fought side by side in the past and exchanged our lives with Cat Han Shengxian. We're like old friends. Don't you trust me, Su Fengnian? Sui Shigu stopped at the door of the study and turned to look at the young king. Trust you? Why don't you trust that old woman with the surname Tantai? Su Fengnian gave him a thumbs up. Senior Xianxia, you're indeed a distinguished figure of the same generation as Lu Songtao of Zhulu Mountain. You have guts. Even I don't dare to call Tantai Pingjing old woman. Deputy Provincial Governor Yang couldn't bear to look at them, let alone listen to them. He strode away. Chapter 1972. Sui Shigu scolded in a low voice. This old man admits defeat. At such a young age, his skin is even thicker than my stomach that is filled with hundreds of famous swords. The young vassal accepted it calmly and smiled. Senior, you flatter me, you flatter me. After the 2 entered the study room, Sui Shigu could not stand the young vassal's pretentious attentiveness. He decisively moved a chair and sat down. This was because he knew that the more attentive this bastard named Su was, the more likely he would suffer in the future. Sui Shigu restrained his expression and asked, Is the left cavalry really gone? Su Fengnian sat behind the desk and nodded. Sui Shigu frowned. Is the right cavalry going to join forces with the Great Snow Dragon cavalry to block them, or are we going to let the Beimang army go straight to North Jiebei City? Su Fengnian didn't beat around the bush. directly saying, "Even if we don't stop them, we won't be able to stop them. Instead of wasting our main force in a meaningless battle, we might as well just let the northern Mang barbarians pile up corpses outside North Resisting City. As long as we can make it through this autumn and winter, when next spring arrives, especially when spring turns to summer, the northern Mang cavalry's days will become more and more difficult to endure." Sui Siegu laughed. "You actually want to reduce the pressure on Huayang Pass, Fatty Chu, right?" Su Fengnian did not answer immediately. A look of surprise flashed across his eyes. Jianghu had been around for 100 years, and its age was comparable to the later Sui, which was China's shortest age. The old man's long years of experience should not be underestimated. Sui Siegu looked around at the simple study that did not have a single piece of furniture on top of the desk. He sighed slightly and said, "It's not easy to be a vassal king with real power like you." Su Fengnian laughed and waved his sleeves, one shoulder bright as the moon, two sleeves clean as the wind, and four bare walls. "My name will definitely go down in history." Sui Siegu mocked, "To think that you can still laugh. Don't you think you've lost your father's face?" Su Fengnian folded his hands in his sleeves and leaned back in his chair. He smiled faintly. "No matter how useless my son is, no matter how disappointed Su Shao is, he can't scold me to my face." Sui Siegu's mouth twitched, but he did not comment. After a long time, he slowly said, "I have lived for so many years, but my impression of the Beimang barbarians is not deep. However, compared to many of the people of the Central Plains who have only experienced the fires of war during the spring and autumn period, I have personally witnessed the cavalry of the grassland on a large scale. At the time, I was only 20 years old and happened to be traveling through Jizhou with a sword on my back. I was at a place where the north and south intersected. In the old northern Han history books, it should be called the Great Pass. As for how the current Liang imperial court is named, I do not know." The old man's tone was gentle, without any heavy or intense emotions. "I saw several thousand cavalry gallop into the pass. I, Sui Siegu, am not a citizen of northern Han. Moreover, I have never had much of an interest in my country. My ambition is to reach the peak of the path of the sword, not caring about worldly affairs. I have even less interest in the struggle for hegemony and the change of the country's surname. As a result, at that time, I did not hot-bloodedly charge into the pass with my sword alone. However, there is a small matter that you may not have seen. At that time, I saw jackals and wolves with full bellies on the side of the road, just like the fat rich men of peaceful times. When those beasts saw people, they actually didn't retreat and instead barked. At that time, I did not feel much about it. I only felt that the weak were prey to the strong, and that it was only right and proper. On the contrary, it made me even more determined to pursue the path of martial arts. However, when I think back to that scene, I feel somewhat uncomfortable. This was actually the reason why the young vassal king did not have the extravagant hope that the grandmasters of the Central Plains would remain in North Resisting City. Just as Sui Siegu had said, thousands and tens of thousands of people had died tragically under the trampling of the steppes' iron hoofs. Their heads and stomachs had been sliced open by war blades. Their corpses had been lifted into the air by spears, and their bodies had been pierced through by bows. No matter how many people died, in the eyes of the Jianghu experts who hoped to seize the championship of martial arts, the same scene in the eyes of the border soldiers and in the eyes of the grandmasters of Jianghu was like the difference between heaven and earth. Perhaps some people were not like the young swordsman Sui Siegu. They would choose to stand up and take the initiative to intercept and kill the steppe cavalry. However, in the end, they would retreat in the face of difficulties. Although he had the 3-foot sword by his side, he chose to watch coldly from the side. Even though he had the 3-foot sword, he still hid his sword in its scabbard. Until now, he only felt uncomfortable. Su Fengnian could not do it. It was not necessarily because Su Fengnian was more benevolent than Sui Siegu. It was only because he was born in the Su family and had followed the cripple's surname since childhood. Perhaps it was not at the border of Bailiang. If it was somewhere else, such as Jizhou or the 2 Liao provinces, if Su Fengnian was only a grandmaster of martial arts who did not participate in the invasion of Beimang from the south, he would also be the same as some of the grandmasters of Jianghu. He would only fight to his heart's content and then retreat in the face of difficulties. He would not have the unyielding determination to retreat. Chai Qingshan, Shui Songguan, Wei Miao, Mao Shulang, Cheng Baishuang, Ji Lu, and so on. These grandmasters of the Central Plains were already in North Resisting City or were about to enter North Resisting City. Why would Su Fengnian want them to die outside the border of Liangzhou and resist the hundreds of thousands of Beimang's cavalry with their flesh and blood? Sui Xiegu, who was resting with his eyes closed, opened his eyes and broke the silence. He said in a low voice, "Heaven can create all things and also kill all things. Su Fengnian, are you really not afraid?" Su Fengnian smiled and asked, "Did Tantai Pingjing say this?" Sui Xiegu did not admit or deny it. Sui Xiegu stood up and walked to the window. His burly figure seemed lonely. The old man mocked himself. "In terms of swordsmanship and sword will, I used to think that I would not lose to anyone. But strangely, I have never liked carrying a sword. Instead, I like to eat swords. Perhaps Li Chungang was right. I'm not a swordsman. Then what am I? I've lived to this age, yet I'm still asking myself this question. What a joke." Before Sui Xiegu left the study room, Su Fengnian proposed a new deal. After a moment of shock, the ancestor of Eating Sword did not refuse or agree. He strode away. After the old man walked out of the study room, he walked slowly in the corridor. Suddenly, he turned his head and looked at the lush loquat tree in the courtyard. Not long after, the young king also left the study room. He handed a secret letter that he had just written to one of the leaders of the torture room. The two of them walked out of the room together. The young king said with a calm face, "After you hand the letter to him, tell him that if there is such a day, I, Su Fengnian, am begging him to do this." The old spy gritted his teeth and did not say a word. He just nodded vigorously. Then he quickly left the mansion and left North Resisting City. Su Fengnian stood on the steps and quietly looked into the distance. The autumn wind blew silently. Beimang's army was about to arrive at North Resisting City. Someone was preparing for his death. The young king turned around gently and looked up to see He and Su Ying sitting side by side on the roof. He made a face at them. Chapter 1973. Deep into the night, there was a porcelain oil lamp in the upper left corner of the study, imitating the style of the old Western shoe porcelain lamps. The lamp was hidden in the lip orifice and could be filled with water. The young man sat alone behind the table, reading a secret letter that he was already familiar with. He had been to the rich Gangnam-do, where the rich and noble families lived. Their houses were tall and bright, showing a peaceful and prosperous atmosphere. He had also been to the Great Peace City. Every festival, every street in the capital would have lotus lanterns. The lights stretched out and the candlelight was like an army marching in the night. It was the most spectacular sight. He had also seen the twinkling stars in the small town at night, and the lights were still dim. When he passed by small and big villages, it was a pleasant surprise to see an extremely small light. He put down the letter, got up, walked around the desk, came to the window and gently pushed the window open. The letter was not an important military document, but a private secret letter that Li Yanchao had submitted to North Jiebei City. However, it did not pass through the military office of North Jiebei City, but was directly sent to the desk of the young king's study. The first deputy commander of the Right Cavalry used a heavy brush, the ink seeping through the back of the paper. Li Yanchao did not write any trivial words. He only wrote two simple sentences: Lu Dian should not have died. No one in Beiliang can treat the death of the left cavalry as the humiliation of the border army. In reality, Li Yanchao did not even need to write this letter. Su Fengnian was more familiar than Li Yanchao with how Lu Dian used troops and how he was as a person. How could a general that Su Shao would mention so many times in the meeting hall of Mount Qing Liang be a normal person? Su Shao had left Liaodong with 800 old soldiers, 40 years of military service, and in the end, 300,000 Beiliang cavalry. There were many generals under his command. There were many who died on the battlefield, but there were also many who survived. Lu Diyuan was a full-fledged cavalry general. Almost everyone in the older generation of the Su family knew about him. From Yan Wenluan and Chen Yunshui to Zhou Kang and Yuan Nanting to Lu Jinu and Li Mofan, They all felt pity for Lu Diun, who suddenly left the Bailiang frontier army. That regret was not inferior to the departure of Wu Qi and Su Pu. Before Lu Diun left the manor for the battlefield, Lu Diun privately visited Su Fengnian in the study and had a heart-to-heart conversation. After all, Lu Diun was not as relaxed and casual as he appeared to be when he assumed the role of commander-in-chief. On the contrary, Lu Diun, who had grown up with the Su clan's cavalry, was more familiar with tough battles than Li Yanchao and Ning Amei, who had risen to prominence outside the Liangzhou Pass, and was used to the saying, "The northern Liang cavalry is the best in the world." It could even be said that the pain and suffering of those years had been carved into his bones. Therefore, Lu Diun had to make everything clear in front of the young lord. Lu Diun wanted to make Su Fengnian feel at ease, and also make himself feel at ease. In that face-to-face conversation, Lu Diun believed that the two cavalry forces of 60,000 would definitely not be able to safely roam in the increasingly narrow crevice outside the pass. Unless the left cavalry retreated to the north of Qingyuan Army Town, and the right cavalry went straight to the east of Grave Tomb Army Town, stretching out the battle line in the northeast and southwest, only then would they have room to breathe. But in this way, although the 60,000 cavalry would drag out an ignoble existence, what would happen to the north? Although the left and right cavalry would still be able to pin down a certain number of Beimang cavalry, but to put it bluntly, the Beimang barbarians didn't even need to send out their main force. They just needed to casually throw two low-level cavalry forces to us, and when the time comes, we would have to lie on the back of our horses and watch the show. I, Lu Diun, am a big uncouth man. How to lead an army into battle, I learned bit by bit from the great general. I also consulted people like Su Pu, Wu Qi, and Yuan Zuozong, Chen Zhibao. But I always felt that in the end, it was neither like a donkey nor like a horse, and it was not as convenient as my original method. In the end, I only believed in one principle: once the cavalry entered the battlefield, they had to defeat the enemy's most elite field forces in one go. They absolutely could not lose the big picture for the sake of small gains and preserve their strength for the sake of the so-called overall situation. Otherwise, in a difficult battle with a great disparity in strength, the longer the battle dragged on, the more difficult it would be to fight. If it was a difficult battle, someone had to fight it. Otherwise, if everyone retreated again and again, all they could do was wait for death. How different would that be from that nest of old foxes and wolf cubs in the Bureau of Military Personnel of Liang? Su Fengnian stood by the window. The autumn air filled the room, and the lone lantern was cold. After opening the window, the chill was even heavier. Su Fengnian turned around. Back then, that man had been sitting on the chair in front of the desk. His appearance was ordinary. If he had not appeared in this study and instead stood on the fields within the pass, he would probably have been mistaken for a farmer with his face to the earth and his back to the sky. Your Highness, when I and the right cavalry set out at the same time, I will take the lead in breaking through to the north one day after the two armies have staggered, luring Murong Baoding's troops to gather their main forces. If nothing unexpected happens, Murong Baoding will definitely hear the news and request reinforcements from Wang Yong, the prefect of Aquarius Province. It's even very likely that he will temporarily transfer the Ruran cavalry to support Dong Lei's private cavalry. Your Highness, please be at ease. Even if my left cavalry is heavily surrounded, we will still kill at least 45,000 of the enemy's elite cavalry. Your Highness, I'll have to trouble you with one thing. When you go back, help me apologize to old Marshal He. Tens of thousands of border soldiers have been entrusted to me, but I can only take them to their deaths. My conscience can't be at ease, but I have no choice but to do this. Lu Diun is waiting for old Marshal He underground. However, it's best if I wait another 8 or 10 years. By then, old Marshal He probably won't have the strength to beat people up. With just a little bit of mercy, I'll be able to reincarnate. After this man stood up, he looked at the young vassal king who had also stood up and said in a low voice, "If in the future it is proven that I, Lu Diun, was wrong, then no one needs to bring wine to my grave. Presumably, I won't be able to drink that wine with a guilty conscience. Of course, that is if I still have a grave." The two of them walked to the door of the study together. Lu Diun suddenly asked, "Your Highness, do you think that in a few decades, there will still be people who remember us?" Remember the battle that happened here? Su Fengnian had shook his head and said, Not necessarily. Damn it. Hi, Your Highness, please forgive me. I'm just a crude person. Nothing good comes out of a dog's mouth. It's fine. Su Xiao is the same. I've long gotten used to it. Everything was still vivid in his mind. Those words were still echoing in his ears for a long time. Su Fengnian pressed his hands on the window and leaned forward. Lu Diyuan, who had rushed to the battlefield with the heart of death, didn't leave any last words. If there were any, it would be too familiar. His Royal Highness had often heard it when he was young. It was just that he had changed his name. Su Fengnian slowly turned his head and looked at the door of the study. The man named Lu Dian had finally clasped his fist and said, I am Lu Di, the former cavalry general of Manjia Battalion, the current deputy commander of Left Cavalry. I request for a battle with you. Su Fengnian's lips moved slightly at that time. The two words were on the tip of his tongue, but in the end he couldn't say it. Allow a battle. Su Fengnian's hands suddenly pressed down heavily. Under his 10 fingers, the bricks on the windowsill shattered. Su Fengnian took a deep breath. He waved his hand at the darkness outside the window, indicating that the men of sacrifice of the Fu Shui room didn't need to pay any attention. He walked back to the desk and pulled out a piece of paper from a yellowed military book. The contents of the paper were the words of a man who had participated in the construction of North Resisting City. He said to his wife and children who had already left Lingzhou. The letter said that after autumn, the weather wasn't too cold. The 1,000-layer cloth shoes sewn together were enough and didn't wear out too much. The clothes he brought to North Resisting City were also enough to keep him warm. He also met 2 fellow villagers from Lingzhou's Longqing County. When he was free, he would go to a small town outside the city to drink a few mouthfuls of wine. The price was cheaper than inside the pass. He heard that they had won the battle in Liuzhou. The walls of North Resisting City were very high. The Beimang barbarians definitely wouldn't be able to break through in a year and a half. He told her and her 2 sons to relax. In the future, as long as they still received the wages sent every month, it meant that the area outside the pass was very peaceful and that there was no war. In the end, the man told his wife not to worry about money and not to worry about it. The children's studies were the most important. The letter was sent to a certain place in the Central Plains, the man's ancestral home. This piece of paper was just a copy. The real letter had naturally been sent out a long time ago. After the man arrived outside the pass, he didn't know how to read, so he couldn't write a letter. He had to find a nameless and poor scholar in the marketplace to help him write it. Under the dim yellow light, Su Fengnian lowered his head to look at the thin piece of paper spread out on the desk. When the last letter was sent out, it happened to be right after Lu Diyuan left North Resisting City. The first day Lu Diyuan re-entered the border army, Beiliang's Fu Shui Bureau had already investigated this man's situation in Lingzhou's Longqing County town for more than 10 years. They sent the information one after another to the North Resisting City governor's residence, and then compiled it and placed it on the desk in this study room. Later on, Lu Diyuan's every move in North Resisting City or the Left Cavalry was recorded by the Fu Shui Bureau spies without any detail. Su Fengnian did not stop them. It was precisely by relying on these seemingly unreasonable and dark rules that Beiliang had reduced the number of casualties on the battlefield by a lot. However, on the matter of Lu Diyuan hiring someone to write a letter for him, Su Fengnian made a special trip to the torture chamber and had the Fu Shui Bureau's chief in charge of related matters not to interfere. It was only on this letter that Su Fengnian went back on his word. He had the Fu Shui Bureau's spies intercept the letter. Unfortunately, the old scholar who did the letter-writing business had already followed the troops and left the border. If they really wanted to find him, with the influence of the Fu Shui Bureau outside the pass, they would be able to find him. However, Su Fengnian thought about it and decided to drop the idea. He felt that since he had the letter in his hands, with his calligraphy skills and skill, it wouldn't be difficult to forge a letter every month. However, at this moment, Su Fengnian regretted it again, because he discovered that it was as if he couldn't pick up the brush at all. Even if he picked up the brush again and again, he didn't know how to write the contents of the letter a month later. Su Fengnian stood up, walked out of the study room, and came to the courtyard. Chapter 1974. Still unable to calm down completely, Su Fengnian rose from the ground and swept to the horse path on the southern wall of Jiebei City. He jumped lightly and sat cross-legged on the top of the wall. Soon, the sound of armor vibrating could be heard from far away on the horse path. When the armored soldiers realized that it was the young lord who had come to the top of the wall, they quickly retreated silently. Although they did not whisper to each other, they could see the passion in each other's eyes. Su Fengnian clenched his fists and propped them up on his legs. He sat in the north and faced the south, looking at the distant night sky. He sat there for a night. Before dawn, he quietly returned to the manor. Not long after he sat down in the study, a spy from the torture chamber came to report that Mao Shulang, Cheng Baishuang, and Ji Lu, the three southern martial art masters were about to arrive at the small town market in the south of the city that had suddenly become sparsely populated. Su Fengnian asked him to prepare a horse. After spending more than an hour dealing with the military and political affairs that had gradually piled up on his desk last night, he left the city alone. Su Fengnian did not specially come to welcome the three grandmasters of the Central Plains. He mainly wanted to take a look at the market and did not have too many reasons. Su Fengnian rode the horse to the small town. He dismounted and led the horse forward slowly. There were wine shops, tea houses, inns, and all kinds of scattered shops. Of course, one could not leave without legs. However, business was extremely poor. Some shops had simply closed down. This was reasonable. In just half a day, 3,000 to 4,000 people had left. Moreover, a large number of people who participated in the construction of the city had begun to return to their hometowns in batches under the escort of the local garrison. As Su Fengnian walked, there were shop assistants squatting under the eaves with sleepy eyes and yawning. The sudden drop in business made them happy to take a break from work. There were merchants who shouted loudly for their servants to move their goods to the south. They looked worried. There were brothel girls who leaned on the railings and looked up at the big red lanterns when they had nothing to do. It was rare for them to wake up so early. There were strong escorts who were escorting rare items from Lingzhou. They only cared about the safety of the goods and did not care about the shopkeeper's frown. At the end of the street, Su Fengnian suddenly saw an old Daoist priest pushing a cart towards the south. He was as thin as a match and his arm strength was weak. There was a linen poster on his cart that was used to solicit business. From top to bottom, there were 2 lines of regular script, Ziwei Do Shu, 8 trigrams 6 lines, not bad, and face and palm reading, Chimen Duanjia, not bad. Su Fengnian smiled knowingly. This fortune teller was really honest. He led the horse forward quickly and bent down to help push the cart. The old man's Taoist robe that had been washed until it was white was out of place. In any case, Su Fengnian had never seen it before during his travels to Liang and Beimeng. This was not strange. Taoist temples that could obtain credentials from the government all had very particular designs for their Taoist robes. If they were to forge and sell them without permission, once the county government found out, the crime would not be small. Back then, Su Fengnian had rented a Taoist robe when he first traveled to Jianghu. It was also a robe of questionable origin that could not be found. Even if the government had their eyes on it and wanted to get to the bottom of it, it would be difficult for them to convict him. The person in front of him was clearly someone similar to His Royal Highness, who was in dire straits back then. The fortune teller, who could barely be called a Taoist priest, narrowed his eyes and said, "Young master, you must be from a wealthy family. If I'm not wrong, your father's generation outside the Great Wall is very powerful." Su Fengnian's words hit the nail on the head. He smiled and said, "You saw that my horse was able to follow its master by itself after the reins were loosened. There's no doubt that it's a Bailiang warhorse. In addition, the war is imminent and I dare to take a horse for a stroll here, so you deduce that I'm a descendant of a general, right?" The fortune teller's smile was forced. The immortal demeanor that he had painstakingly squeezed out disappeared, and he was beaten back to his original state. Su Fengnian sighed and said, "To be honest, in my early years, I was similar to you. In order to make a living, I pretended to be a god and became a fortune teller. You're a little better than me at that time. In any case, you have a tricycle." Su Fengnian joked, "But to be honest, you're really like a crane in a flock of chickens with your banner. How can you have any business?" The old man laughed and said, "Actually, it doesn't matter. Earning money here mainly depends on writing letters for people or peddling small safety talismans folded from yellow paper. 3 copper coins for one, so my business is passable." Before those Baelyang foreigners left, it was enough for me to eat meat and drink wine twice a day. Commoners like me are just ordinary people. When we pray to Buddha, God, and Bodhisattva, we must first ask for peace and stability. Then we ask for marriage and the right time. Finally, we ask for scholarly achievements and riches. Young master, don't you think so? Su Fengnian nodded and said softly, "The commoners are actually using 3 copper coins to get peace of mind. You're doing a good thing." As if recalling those happy times of drinking wine and eating meat, the elder's face beamed with joy. However, soon after, he couldn't help but angrily say, "If our prince was a bit more formidable, this little old man's business would still be good for a month or so. Who would have thought that the northern Mang barbarians would attack North Rejecting City so early? What a waste of my life to obtain this trade. I've suffered a great loss. Now that I've returned to the pass, the days will be hard to bear." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "That vassal king really deserves to be scolded. What great grandmaster of wushu commentary! It's useless." Perhaps he realized that the young master beside him was a son of a general and was closely related to the rise and fall of the Baelyang Su family. In Jianghu, it was reasonable to say too much and it was taboo to talk too much. Therefore, the old man quickly changed his tone and mediated, "You can't say that. It's not easy for our prince to support such a large family property. His luck is not good either. Soon the Baymang barbarians will invade and they won't even give us a chance to fart. It's still not easy for our prince and the border army." The old man seemed to be unable to make up any more lies. He became more embarrassed and seemed to be restrained. His strength to push the cart became weaker. Chapter 1975. Su Fengnian increased the force of his hand and smiled. "Sir, you're lying. Don't worry, even though I'm a general of Baelyang, I can still listen to the words of others. I don't care if they're good or bad. Of course, I'll be happier if I hear good things." The old man and Su Fengnian pushed the cart south and were about to cross the river. The old man looked back at the towering city walls and suddenly stomped his feet. "There are some things that I can't hold back. Even if you bring me to Baelyang City to condemn me, I'll still spit it out." Su Fengnian smiled bitterly. "All right, I'm sure it won't be anything good. Sir, please speak. I'll pretend I didn't hear anything." The old man laughed and straightened his back. He turned north and pointed at Baelyang City. "Sir, I've heard a lot of rumors recently. They're all saying that our prince is too daring. He didn't use so many old generals but chose to use those kids who haven't even grown hair yet. How can we fight this battle? Who won the first battle of Liangmang? Wasn't it General Lu Jinu of Liangzhou's Hutu City? Wasn't it General Wang Lingbao of Liuzhou's Longxiang army? Wasn't it because of Yozhou's Crouching Bao and Crane Luanglo? Wasn't it because of the dead officers of the 3 cities? Wasn't it because of our Baelyang's most outstanding Great Snow Dragon cavalry and the 2 heavy cavalry armies that we've trained for many years? How many young foreigners are there? Only Melancholy Blade can barely be considered one. In my opinion, don't look at how Liuzhou has won a few battles. When it comes to critical moments, young people can't be relied on." The old man turned to look at the side of the young man's face and asked, "Sir, what do you think?" Su Fengnian looked into the distance. "Sir's words make some sense. However, the world is strange. Some things that make sense aren't necessarily true." The old man's eyes widened. "Sir, are you a scholar or a general's son? Why can't I understand what you're saying?" Su Fengnian sighed. "I don't deserve to be called a scholar. It shouldn't be wrong to say that I'm a general's son. I grew up drinking sand, smelling horse dung, and listening to drums." After boldly expressing his thoughts, the old man's mood relaxed. He rarely joked. "Sir, other than being unreasonable, you're quite easy to talk to." Su Fengnian said helplessly, "Old mister, is this a compliment or an insult?" The old man laughed and said, "Young master, you just have to listen to nice things. You'll never go wrong." Su Fengnian's mood also lightened up, and the haze between his brows gradually faded away. He smiled knowingly and said, "I've learned something." The old man didn't ask Su Fengnian to help push the carriage across the bridge. He pushed the carriage south alone. He lowered his voice and muttered to himself, "If only the great general was still alive. How would the Beimeng barbarians dare come to our side? Bailiang doesn't even know how to fight. So what if we've won the battle? So many people will still die. I heard that there are 300,000 stone tablets behind Mount Qingliang. They're all empty toys. Being able to live is at least better than leaving behind a name after death, right?" Su Fengnian stood still and didn't say anything. The old man certainly couldn't guess the young man's identity. He didn't think that a martial arts master would help him push the carriage, so he continued to complain, "In my opinion, since the Central Plains Imperial Court is not a good thing, it's better to directly open the gate and let the Beimeng barbarians enter the Bailiang Pass instead of letting our Bailiang Frontier Army soldiers die outside the pass. As long as both sides don't bump into each other inside and outside the Bailiang Pass, everything will be fine. Let those ungrateful people in the Central Plains suffer. Our people in Bailiang can live a peaceful life. I don't want to see the young king, or I'll definitely persuade him not to be impulsive and listen to the old man's advice. Don't blindly try to be a hero." Su Fengnian narrowed his eyes and raised his head. The autumn wind messed up the young man's hair. Maybe it was because he was miserable, or maybe it was because he felt guilty, or maybe it was both, so the young king didn't speak from beginning to end. On the south side of the bridge, the back of the old man pushing the carriage was getting farther and farther away. Su Fengnian seemed to remember something and shouted, "Old man, don't be in a hurry to go south. And don't forget that within 20 days, the people can use the 3 post-house roads from Beiqing City to Liangzhou Pass. There's no need to take a long detour." The old fortune-teller seemed to have heard the shout. He paused for a moment, indicating to the young man that he understood, and then continued to go south. After the mansion was built, the study room received confidential intelligence reports from inside and outside the pass every day. There were reports from the Fu Shui room and the Ying room. Bailiang's intelligence reports were always divided into 3 levels according to priority. Originally, the intelligence reports that were qualified to be sent to the study room were only the A-level intelligence reports. But the young king asked for an extra level of intelligence reports. In fact, it was not important for military affairs, but the new king used it to ease the tension. Although the 2 branches must have done a certain degree of screening, and it was impossible to really send all the intelligence reports to the study room, the number was still relatively large, and most of them were related to the situation of the academy or the scholars' opinions. The content was varied, and there was no lack of some extreme comments from young scholars. The young king always just browsed and didn't comment. There was a comment that the young king personally wrote down and used it as a daily self-reflection. Little virtue but high status, little wisdom but great schemes, little strength but heavy responsibilities. With such a muddle-headed king in charge of the border, the Bailiang Frontier Army will undoubtedly be defeated. The army's pressure, the father's last wish, the bitter cold hometown, the imperial court's constraint, the beautiful Central Plains, innocent people, and the heavenly law's pressure. They were all heavy responsibilities, layered on top of each other. On the north side of the bridge, the young man, who was less than 4 years old, slowly squatted down by the river. After dusting a licorice, he put it in his mouth and gently chewed. His mouth was full of sweetness. Chapter 1976. Su Fengnian suddenly stood up and whistled softly. The warhorse drinking water by the riverside galloped over. After mounting the horse, Su Fengnian grabbed the reins with one hand and clenched his other hand into a fist. He knocked heavily on his shoulder and grinned. Far away in the south, the old man did not stop walking. Tears flowed down his face as he muttered softly, "How do you feel now?" The old man finally stopped and looked around. All he could see was the yellow sand of the desert. Tide Listening Pavilion strategist Li Yishan did not have a burial place after his death. His ashes were scattered outside the pass. The old man smiled and said, "Yishan, in life and in death I was not as good as you." At the southern gate of Beiqing City, Su Fengnian suddenly stopped his horse and turned his head. The slight abnormality that he sensed with his celestial being body was fleeting. In an instant, Calmness was restored and no trace could be found. Like an autumn leaf falling into a pond, there were few ripples. It was quiet and serene. Previously, in that unknown corridor in Liuzhou, the Liuzhou infantry faced off against the 50,000 southern cavalry of Beimang. Liangzhou's General Shi Fu was indeed as stated in the military document he submitted to the king of Fongbei City. He did not lead the 6,000 Qingyuan army elite cavalry to rush to the aid of the corridor battlefield. Instead, he stood firm on the plains south of the corridor, patiently waiting for Huang Songpu's main force to withdraw to the north. At the same time, he needed to prevent the southern dynasty's border cavalry reinforcements from going south to join up with Huang Songpu's remaining troops. This Liangzhou general only symbolically sent a scout to the corridor to investigate the military situation. Shi Fu stopped his horse and looked south. His back was always to the bloody battlefield that was destined to be filled with corpses. His face was calm and his heart was stone. On the southernmost Old Woman Mountain main battlefield, Liang Mang's side suffered the heaviest casualties in the third charge. Ko Jianghuai threw in the cavalry that belonged to the Liuzhou provincial governor manor. Huang Songpu also used 600 true heavy cavalry. The men and horses were all equipped with armor. Every particularly tall and strong Beimang warhorse was equipped with face, neck, chest, body armor, and parasitic armor. They were collectively known as iron cavalry armor that spears and arrows could not penetrate. Qi Fu Longguan, the young general who temporarily took control of the Lu province cavalry from Ko Jianghuai, once again led the remaining direct collision camp cavalry to charge at the 600 heavy cavalry. Only, while Qi Fu Longguan led the charge, Su Longxiang personally led the 300 dragon elephant elite cavalry, gradually catching up to the direct collision camp on the battlefield. In the end, they were neck to neck with the direct collision camp, opening up the formation together. After the 3 charges, the Liuzhou cavalry was almost completely wiped out. The Longxiang army also suffered great losses. On the other hand, even though Huang Songpu's elite cavalry suffered great losses, the most numerous E-type cavalry still miraculously maintained a high level of integrity. There were 30,000 cavalry. According to the situation of the Old Woman Mountain battlefield, even without the 50,000 reinforcements, Commander Huang Songpu had full confidence in wiping out the Liuzhou main force. However, right at this time, a majestic cavalry army entered their field of vision from the plains east of Old Woman Mountain. That scene was like the sun rising over the eastern sea. This elite cavalry army that came to reinforce Old Woman Mountain without any warning spread out in a line. Like a wave of Guangling River, they rapidly advanced from east to west. This cavalry army that appeared out of nowhere was definitely the easiest to recognize apart from the great snow dragon cavalry in the Beiliang frontier army. This was because each of their helmets had a snow-white eagle feather that fluttered in the wind. On the sides of each horse's saddle, there were arrows that shot out like 2 lumps of reed flowers. The cavalry's advance was like a great snowstorm surging between heaven and earth. Not only was the armor dyed in blood, the 2 spears that had already been replaced, the Beimang commander Huang Songpu's face was covered in blood. He turned his head to the east, his eye sockets about to split apart. On the Old Woman Mountain battlefield, after both sides spared no effort in the 3 vicious attacks, their Beimang cavalry army just happened to be at the original Liuzhou cavalry position. This was originally the plan of this Beimang Southern Dynasty's number 1 person. He wanted to wait until Liuzhou's main force suffered great losses, their energy falling to rock bottom. As long as the Beimang cavalry army was in the southern battlefield, they would be able to form a natural line of defense that could prevent the Liuzhou cavalry from turning back to the south. However, reality proved that the old commander's plan succeeded. However, Ko Jianghuai's plan also succeeded. That young Liuzhou main general didn't plan on withdrawing from Old Woman Mountain at all. He clearly wanted to turn around and surround the Beimang army. Huang Songpu didn't hesitate in the slightest. He ordered the entire army to do their best to break through the encirclement. Even if they were ambushed along the way, they were not to be entangled in battle. They just had to head north and meet up with the reinforcements that were about to arrive at the northern battlefield of Old Woman Mountain. Victory would still be on the side of Beimang. Qi Fu Longguan, Su Longxiang and Liamo Fan, These three generals who had fought side by side at Old Woman Mountain didn't even need to greet each other before they quickly changed their formation. From the left, middle, and right armies' Yanxi formation to a horizontal snake formation, stretching out as far as possible to form a long front line. Every dog has its day. It was now the turn of the Liuzhou border army's front, middle, and back to charge. Li Mo Fan's Dragon Elephant Cavalry was in the front 2 rows, Su Longxiang's army was in the middle, and Qi Fu Longguan's remaining Liuzhou cavalry was at the back. What they needed to do was no longer to kill the enemy. They only needed to try their best to stop the horse hooves of Huang Songpu's main force from breaking through the encirclement. After Yuan Nanting's White Feather Light Cavalry unleashed 3 waves of arrows from the flanks of Northern Mang's main army, another 6,000 cavalry with an imposing aura found an opportunity to draw their blades in an orderly fashion and charge into the enemy formation. It was as if they had sliced through the waist of Beimang's cavalry formation. Huang Songpu's direct cavalry, Wanyan's private cavalry, and the 30,000 second cavalry were all sliced in half. The rest of the main force, the White Feather Light Cavalry, began to circle northward, not engaging in a chaotic battle with the Northern Mang army. Instead, they relied on the advantage of light cavalry, which was originally charging from east to west, to quickly circle northward. If someone had just climbed to the top of Old Woman Mountain and looked down at the battlefield, they would probably think that this light cavalry was an ally of the grassland cavalry, and that they were heading north together from the left and right. Beimang's Kiliarchs and Centurions led their remaining forces to charge fearlessly at the right flank of the White Feather Light Cavalry in despair. Unfortunately, that heroic scene ended up like a stone hitting a river. It couldn't disrupt the pace of the White Feather Light Cavalry at all. The White Feather Light Cavalry, after suffering from the Northern Mang Cavalry's diagonal charge, easily moved slightly closer to the right. The leftmost formation that was originally more or less straightforward now had depressions everywhere, as if there were pockets that the Northern Mang Deathsworn soldiers smashed into. What awaited these grassland barbarians was definitely not the Northern Cold Blade that engaged in close combat, but rather the extremely skilled cavalry archery. The 200 to 300 Southern Court cavalry were shot down like rice paddies, without the slightest bit of bitterness from the collisions, not dying miserably on horseback. When faced with the White Feather Light Cavalry's arrows, the Northern Mang cavalry, who were able to continue charging a dozen or so steps forward before falling off their horses, they only felt a type of remaining grievance and helplessness. When faced with the White Feather Light Cavalry's arrows, the Northern Mang cavalry, who were able to continue charging more than 10 steps forward before falling off their horses, only felt a type of remaining grievance and helplessness. In the northernmost part of the Crone Mountain battlefield, only dust could be vaguely seen. It was the 4,000 iron stupas under Ningame's command that were inserted between the two battlefields. At the peak of the Crone Mountain, Ko Jianghuai said calmly, "The situation is set. Huang Songpu is finished." Chen Shiliang also saw the situation on the battlefield. A smile appeared on his pale face. He turned his head and said with a hoarse voice, "General Ko is worthy of the title, God of War." Ko Jianghuai looked to the east. "I'm afraid of losing the big picture for the small." Chen Shiliang asked doubtfully, "After the battle at the Crone Mountain, what's wrong with sending troops east to reinforce North Resisting City?" Ko Jianghuai shook his head. "Who said we're going to North Resisting City?" Chen Shiliang was dumbfounded. At the foot of the Crone Mountain, Li Hanlin gathered the crossbowmen and prepared to enter the battlefield again. The secret retainer that was sent by the young king to protect the White Horse Commandant, Lu Huang of the Martial Emperor City, was about to get on his horse and follow them. Li Hanlin said with a firm expression, "Lu Huang, you go directly to North Resisting City." A dignified martial Dao great grandmaster eating sand behind my butt. So boring. Lu Huang didn't seem to be surprised at all. He sat on the horse and looked at the mostly young faces. Finally, he smiled and nodded at Li Hanlin. He joked, "Boy, don't be greedy and die. Otherwise, your king of Baoyang won't forgive me." Li Hanlin grinned. "Help me tell Brother Nian that we made a promise when we were young to pee in the temple of West Beimang. His share, I'll take care of it." Lu Huang rolled his eyes and reminded, "Then remember to drink more water before doing it." Li Hanlin laughed. I'll even drink horse pee. Lu Huang gave a thumbs up before he rode away. I'm convinced. In the Battle of the Corridor, 6 battles and 6 defeats. The 50,000 people of Beimang's southern border town cavalry were completely driven into madness. After 6 charges, there were only 20,000 people left. Even if they knew that they were unable to help the Old Woman Mountain battlefield, even if they were destined to be severely punished by the Emperor, these red-eyed grassland cavalry still launched the 7th attack without hesitation. As long as Qiao Wei led his 9,000 elite cavalrymen into the battlefield from the north entrance of the corridor, even if it was only 30 minutes later, the monk soldiers of Mount Lantua and the 3,000 soldiers of Liuzhou would be completely wiped out. When Qiao Wei personally led 800 men of sacrifice to break through Beimang's formation and killed all the way to the circular formation formed by only 200 people, there were only corpses. Along the way, they saw shattered iron shields, broken lances, broken Modeo swords, and destroyed bows and crossbows scattered all over the place. The so-called simple circular formation was just the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain and the young men of Liuzhou who were all heavily injured. They were just waiting for death. The one who really blocked the charge of Beimang's barbarian cavalry was a slender man in armor and covered in blood. He was the eldest disciple of Wang Xianxia of Martial Emperor City, the Grand Master of the Central Plains, Yu Groom. This person held a modeo that cut horses and a cold saber hung on his left and right waist. The number of Beimang cavalry that died under his saber was no less than 900. Yu Groom had personally promised the young king that he would ensure that Xie Shibian didn't die. Chapter 1977. It was not that he could not forcefully take Xie Shibian out of the corridor and out of this blood-soaked battlefield. But when Xie Shibian personally fought a bloody battle and defeated the Beimang cavalry for the 5th time, he firmly shook his head at Yu Groom. Yu Groom laughed it off and did not force him. Instead, he picked up a long spear and a mo sword from the battlefield. The two fought side by side. This continued all the way until Western Xie suffered serious injuries. At that time, this Lu province deputy general who couldn't get up was grabbed by a middle-aged monk who was in charge of Western Xie's safety by the shoulder from under the hooves of a northern Mang cavalry and then heavily flung backwards. The monk, who was already an arrow at the end of its flight, was instead swarmed by several dozen riders, dying on the spot. Qiao Wei's cavalry quickly slaughtered their way out from behind, becoming the final straw that broke the camel's back. After the northern Mang side cavalry barely managed to stop Qiao Wei's vanguard cavalry charge, they were quickly completely routed. These cavalry of the southern dynasty did not dare to fight or die. Otherwise, they would not have charged to their deaths 7 times. But Qiao Wei's cavalry appeared out of the blue. It was too sudden and too fierce. Especially in the narrow corridor, 9,000 cavalry launched an endless charge. It was as if there was only the endless figures of the Beimang cavalry in their field of vision. The northern Mang cavalry suffered a crushing defeat. After a major commander led 700 riders under his command towards the bridegroom's ruined circular formation that was clearly already on the verge of collapse, but still wasn't willing to fall, all of the southern court's border cavalry made their way around that unfamiliar martial Dao Grand Master who could hold back 10,000 men by himself, quickly making their way around that circular formation, decisively fleeing south from both sides. Qiao Wei jumped off the back of his horse and almost fell. He stumbled into the round formation and finally saw the young general sitting cross-legged with a blade. His helmet was long gone and his armor was broken. Blood blurred his originally elegant face. A one-armed young man from Liuzhou had to use his elbow to lightly press against the back of this general. Qiao Wei knelt on one knee and reached out his trembling hand to gently wipe away the blood on the young general's face. In fact, the young general had already lost consciousness. He was just holding on to his last breath, unwilling to collapse. Yu Groom ruthlessly threw out his modeo, splitting a Beimang cavalry general's, 2 people, and their horses into 2 halves. He came to Qiao Wei and Xie Shibian's side, squatted down behind them, and reached out to hold Xie Shibian's wrist. Let's not talk about the external injuries, but the internal organs have been injured. Only if you are lucky enough will you have a chance to survive. Without saying a word, Qiao Wei turned around and punched the bridegroom's chest. His eyes were red as he scolded angrily. Su Fengnian asked you to stay by Xia Shibian's side just for this bullshit, slim chance of survival? Bridegroom, you didn't say anything. He just continued to lower his head and inject a gentle aura into Xia Shibian. Xia Shibian was not willing to leave. Yu Groom, who had never been on the battlefield, did not know why, but he also felt that he should not leave. The two of them did not leave. Xie Shibian felt that he should die in battle here. Yu Groom felt that dying in the yellow sand outside Liuzhou Pass was not too bad. However, after saving the deputy general of Liuzhou many times, the latter angrily said, "Yu Groom, you. Every time you save me, you kill 3 or 4 fewer people. Do you want me to teach you how to calculate this?" After punching Yu Groom, Chao Wei did not immediately pull back his arm. Instead, he loosened his fist and heavily patted this grandmaster of the Central Plains on the shoulder. He choked out, "Thank you." Yu Groom still did not raise his head. He only asked, "After Xia Shibian's injuries have stabilized, can I entrust him to you and send him to Qingtsang in Liuzhou? I want to go to North Rejecting City." Chao Wei nodded and did not say anything. After a long time, Yu Groom loosened his fingers and slowly stood up. He pressed both hands on the cold sabers at his waist and asked again, "Temporarily lend me 2 sabers. Does this count as violating Bailiang's military law?" Chao Wei took a deep breath and shook his head with a smile. "From now on, Yu Groom, are a cavalry commandant under Great General Chao's command. How about it? The battle in the corridor was won by you through your own merits. Not to mention 2 cold sabers, you can hang them all over your body." Yu Groom laughed it off. Joining the Bailiang Frontier Army and becoming a cavalry general under Chao Wei was absolutely impossible for the first disciple of Wang Xianji who was focused on martial arts. However, Yu Groom could not refuse this kindness. He lowered his head and stared at Xie Shibian who he had pulled back from the gates of hell. Then he walked a few steps away and tiptoed. His body instantly rose from the ground. He went straight to North Rejecting City. On the day when the young lord of North Rejecting City and the 3 martial grandmasters of Nanjiang entered the city one after another, the great victory at Old Woman Mountain in Liuzhou was quickly reported to North Rejecting City. The city was bustling with noise. However, almost 2 hours later, another urgent spy report came to the mansion. The 400,000 cavalrymen of Beimang would arrive at North Rejecting City in 3 days at the latest. After Mao Shulang entered the North Rejection City, he requested to climb up the city wall. After getting permission from the mansion, the burly old man began to walk alone along the horse path. He walked and stopped, not saying a word. The old scholar in green, Cheng Baishuang, quickly broke through the realm on small lotus peak of Wudong Mountain and directly entered the great celestial state. After accompanying his good friend Ji Lu and into the mansion, he stayed in the ceremonial room and learned from the famous literary guru, Chancellor Wang. Only Ji Lu, the chief guest of the Dragon Palace of Nanjiang, came to the study of the second hall to visit the famous young lord of the Central Plains. Su Fengnian did not deliberately go down the stairs to greet him. He just stood at the door of the study with a smile on his face. After leading Ji Lu and into the study, he personally handed him a cup of Bailiang Frontier Army's tribute tea. Ji Lu and took the tea and sat down. He went straight to the point and said, "Your Highness, if I am willing to go out of the city to fight, is there a place for me?" Su Fengnian also asked directly, "Is it just a formality to fish for fame in the Central Plains? Or do you really want to go all out and fight to the end?" Ji Lu gently twisted the tea lid and rubbed the edge of the cup. He raised his head and asked, "What's the difference?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "If it's the former, it's simple. You don't even need to enter the battlefield. I will let Fu Shui and Yang Ying branch release the news to encourage you." Tu Lin smiled, "What if I choose the latter?" Su Fengnian said indifferently, "Then I'm afraid Mr. Ji will have to say his last words to the 2 old friends of Nanjiang first. Because Beimang's 400,000 troops will come to North Rejecting City in 3 days, you won't have the chance to follow Bailiang's cavalry to fight outside the pass. You will only have an extremely difficult battle to fight. To tell you the truth, even I don't have the confidence to say that I can defend North Resisting City." Ti Lu, who was sitting on the chair opposite the desk, was silent. He hadn't even taken a sip of the tea in his hand. Jiu and finished the tea in his cup in one gulp and gently placed it on the desk. He then placed his sword on his knees and smiled calmly. If I didn't come to Bailiang with Qing Baishuang, I wouldn't care about the outcome of Liang Mang's war. But since I'm here, I might as well take this opportunity to vent my anger. Su Fengnian said softly, decades of hard work in martial arts. It's not easy to have the cultivation of a grandmaster. Ji Lu and suddenly laughed angrily. Speaking of martial arts, Your Highness, are you saying that I, Ji Lu, have spent decades of my life as a dog? Su Fengnian was stunned for a moment. He quickly waved his hand and said with a smile, Mr. Ji, don't say it out loud. Ji Lu and glared at him. At this moment, Ji Lu and quickly turned his head and was shocked to see a young girl hanging upside down outside the window. She pointed to Su Fengnian's direction. Su Fengnian said softly, I know, don't worry. Not long after, the peach blossom sword god, Dong Tai, who had 2 swords hanging from his waist, slowly walked into the study. Ji Lu and stood up and nodded to Dong Tai to greet him. There had always been many talented swordsmen in the world of swordsmen. But after the death of the previous generation's sword god, Li Chungang, there was only one person in front of him who was worthy of being called the most talented swordsman. Since Ji Lu and was a swordsman, no matter if he was conceited or arrogant, no matter how high his status was in Jianghu, he should respect this ordinary-looking middle-aged swordsman. After Dong Tai calmly returned the greeting, he directly turned his head to look at the young king and asked, I won't drink the tea. Just tell me, when will the war with Beimang start? Where do you need me to be? Su Fengnian said, I may need to trouble you to fight twice. The first time will be quick, in a few days. The second time, it may only be the 2 of us, and the battlefield will be further away. Dong Tai said calmly, the 2 swords I brought are enough. After saying this, Dong Tai turned and left. Ji Lu and also said goodbye to Su Fengnian and followed the peach blossom sword god's footsteps to ask him some questions about swordplay. There were different levels of knowledge and specialization in different fields. Dong Tai could be said to be the top swordsman in the world, whether it was swordplay or swordsmanship. Most importantly, although Ji Lu and was only at the mysterious finger realm, he had never shown his trump card, the 3 swords. He believed that his power could kill a celestial state master. Dong Tai had always been recognized as the world's #1 mysterious finger realm master. He was even better than Catman Han Shengxian. How could Ji Lu and not be tempted to ask for some advice? On the same day, the Snow House Spear Saintly Hongho and many other top Jianghu bosses entered North Reject City. Su Fengnian did not show up, even the polite greetings were skipped. It was only when a blind female Guqin player entered the city that Su Fengnian personally went to the gate of the mansion. The 2 who had faced each other in life and death in the past walked together to the meeting hall. Su Fengnian asked curiously, Miss Xue, do you have a message for Su Su or this old man Lu? The blind lady with the Guqin bag shook her head and said, Su Su's guilt towards Bailiang, I will repay it. Su Fengnian stopped in his tracks. Have you ever thought that if you die outside Liangzhou Pass, who will repay Su Su's regret for the rest of her life? Xue Songguan's tone was as cold as usual. I only know that Su Su is not happy. I did not do what I could, I will not be happy in this life. Su Fengnian shook his head and said in a low voice, Xue Songguan, I advise you to return to Western Shu and return to Su Su's side.